will be your MC for what remains of this conference, which is two very interesting panels and a concluding fireside chat. So let's get going with today's agenda. The first session, which I'm delighted to be moderating, is called Agricultural Markets and Nutrition. This session asks a question that is deceptively simple, perhaps, which is how do agricultural systems interact with nutritional outcomes, to shape nutritional outcomes? Where do markets succeed or fail in delivering not just calories, but health and opportunity? And importantly, how can public policy bridge the gaps? Look, I'm not going to chair a session today of all days, this week of all weeks, on nutrition and not talk about the situation in Gaza. We're not going to address it. The sort of research that's going to be presented today is not really going to address these sorts of questions of political economy and of moral correctness and ethics and humanity. But I did just want to acknowledge that is underway, and that is very directly related to at least some of the research we'll be talking about in terms of the outcomes, but the processes that are leading us to where we are in Gaza are very different from what we're going to be talking about. The panelists are going to be talking about today, just to acknowledge that. These things, these questions, you know, they are technical. They're also moral, obviously, not only in the sorts of humanitarian crises that I just talked about in Gaza, in Ethiopia and elsewhere. In fact, some of the research today that will be presented is about a similar situation, sort of in moral dimensions to some extent in Ethiopia, but this is a world where nearly, I think 1 in 10 people are undernourished, and the vast majority of them live in low and middle income countries. Healthy diets remain unaffordable to many in low and middle income countries. So understanding how agricultural markets shape food access, how they shape nutritional outcomes is essential, even if it is, as I just acknowledged, part of the picture. This isn't just about yield and supply chains. It is fundamentally about who eats, what they eat, and what the impacts are on not only them, but the future generations, as well as research will show on this panel. And we know that these dynamics are shifting, that climate change, that conflict, of course, that global price shocks are disrupting supply chains in ways that amplify existing inequalities. At the same time, we don't have to be all gloom and doom, I suppose. New data sources, innovations in measurement, and really rigorous, smart empirical work of the type that we're going to see today are opening the door to better policymaking, and that should give us some hope. And so this panel reflects some of the urgency that I talked about, but also the possibility of opportunity. So we have 4 outstanding presenters who are going to present work that spans theory, data, and policy, each presenting sort of a different piece of that interlocking pathway that goes from agricultural systems to nutritional outcomes, including of the sort of succeeding generations. So first up is Chris Barrett, who is the Stephen B. and Janice G. Ashley Professor of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University. He will provide a broad overview of agricultural markets in sub-Saharan Africa. He's going to build upon a whole body of his work, which really highlights how persistent structural challenges coexist with areas of real promise in a region where agriculture remains central to livelihoods, and this is something we touched upon yesterday, as well as to food security. Next up will be William Masters, who is a professor of food and nutrition policy and programs, as well as of economics at Tufts University. Will explore how we measure poverty, or how we might measure poverty through the lens of diet costs and diet affordability, but just not just calories, but also diet quality, crucially. Offering a nutrition-sensitive perspective that I think is really important to inform, again, the conversations we were having about poverty and poverty measurement earlier in this conference. Then Kibram Teferi, who's an economist in the World Bank's research group, will present his work on early childhood shocks and their intergenerational impacts. This work shows that early life adversity leaves a lasting imprint, not only on those who directly experience that adversity, but on their offspring as well. And last but not the least, Kathy Bayless is a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She will present work on the impacts of food subsidies for both producers and consumers. So this is really interesting, cool work that links the two parts of that puzzle, focusing on child nutritional outcomes as the key indicator. So each speaker will have time to present their work, and then that'll be followed by some Q&A. And I really encourage you to engage actively and thoughtfully when we get to the Q&A. So with that, Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ishani, for the generous introduction. It's a pleasure to get to lead off because coffee hasn't kicked in, so can't attribute whatever feeling of sleepiness you might have to my slides. Ishani asked me to give a broad overview, so I'll do that. The big changes in low and middle income countries come from a range of different things, some of them horrific, climate change, conflict, et cetera, but much of it's the natural process of economic development. So I will try to walk you through a very broad overview of what are the mechanisms through which the transformation of markets, agri-food markets, I'm going to refer to it this way because I want to talk not just about the commodities produced on the farm, but equally the foods people eat and the transformations that happen in between. I'm going to talk about how the transformation of markets, agri-food markets, ultimately affect nutritional transitions and nutritional outcomes, with an emphasis on what's the research agenda going forward. So I'm trying to position this hopefully to inform some of the younger participants in the conference on a research agenda. And I'll start with rather familiar, indeed fairly old ideas that are nonetheless very salient today and transition towards newer things where I really think the possibilities for policy impactful research are quite significant. And it helps if I turn on the remote. So the first thing to just keep in mind by way of broad framing is these structural transformations are very broad. This goes back at least to Lewis, Rosenstein, Rodin, lots of early thinkers as the post-World War II era of independence, decolonization began to liberate countries from the yokes of colonialism and open up new opportunities for independent economic development. And so the narrative here is very familiar. Most people think of this in terms of a very heavily agrarian population where transformation in the form of improved agricultural technologies begins to free up labor, investable capital, promote demand for non-food, non-agricultural products, which ignites the kind of familiar Lewis process of structural transformation. And with that comes rural to urban migration, and importantly, a very big dietary transition. And I'm going to be focusing on how the market transformation is associated with, potentially causally, the dietary transformation and the manifestation of nutritional outcomes. So a key part here is to recognize that structural transformation and markets development, the kind of shorthand I'll use, are highly correlated. They're bidirectionally causal. It's very hard to separate that out. And frankly, I'm not sure that's an especially productive project. But the key things behind it are the improved physical and institutional infrastructure. And that will matter because, as I'll talk about, you're going to see the transformation of farmers becoming consumers. But that requires evacuating product that you grow and being able to have low-cost import of processed product that farmers are buying in rural areas. But the institutional environment matters a lot, in particular product standards, as I'll come to a little later. And all of this goes hand in hand with increased spatial and intertemporal market integration, which matters a lot because one of the disturbing features of nutrition is our bodies actually require key trace elements with high regularity. So the annual average, or what you get over a period of 5 years in a panel data set, your body doesn't really care. It cares about whether you are getting essential nutrients roughly each week. Depends a lot on the nutrient. So that's the big picture setting. I'm going to talk about 4 specific mechanisms involved in market-mediated nutritional impacts. And by market-mediated, I mean the transformation of agri-food markets. The first and most familiar and obvious is incomes. We'll then talk about prices, both overall real food prices, if we create a composite, what happens as real food prices change, but then in particular about relative food prices, because nutrition doesn't come equally from all food groups. We'll then talk about product variety and composition and risk management. And if you want a quick, really nice summary of this, Will has a really outstanding handbook of agricultural economics chapter with some co-authors just a couple of years ago that walks through many, not all of these topics. So that provides much more detail than I'm able to give you in a few minutes. So the first mechanism by which improve market integration, improve market infrastructure, the promotion of engagement, kind of the transition from semi-subsistence to fully market engaged production by a largely agrarian population. The first mechanism by which that impacts nutrition is income effects on the farm. Farmers, net sellers at least, making more money because they're able to sell more at higher prices as the transactions and search costs of market exchange fall, but also the pass-through effects on labor demand and farm workers. Both employment volumes and real wages commonly go up, and we see urban-rural wage convergence. So this is a big effect, because obviously starting from low incomes, the higher people's income, given Engel curves, you see a significant increase in food intake with generally improved nutritional outtakes. And I emphasize generally, because we'll come to some refinements, some nuance shortly. So you see this in lots of places. In Ethiopia, I have a picture of the Ethiopian Commodities Exchange pricing board in a distant, dusty town in southern Ethiopia, Yabelo, that I took years ago. Tea pickers who demand for whose labor is increasing, and you can see evidence of improvements in their nutrition, advancements in the infrastructure for small dairy farmers in Madagascar that enables them to evacuate product. Lots of different mechanisms. Bottom line is incomes for farmers and farm workers grow. Their nutrition improves, especially when it starts from a low base. One of the reasons for this is as their incomes grow, people want a more diverse diet. I mean, one of the defining empirical regularities of low-income smallholder agriculture is a relatively monotonous diet. So that diversification, which is commonly referred to as Bennett's Law, surprisingly understudied. Ishani has a nice working paper on this, by the way, that those interested in Bennett's Law might want to check out. But that diversification doesn't imply farmers have to diversify. Indeed, one of, I think, the under-recognized empirical regularities of structural transformation is how fast smallholder farmers become food buyers. That we see here data from the nationally representative household surveys in Vietnam from 92 to 2016 in a paper Yan Yan Lu from IFPRI led. And the striking thing here is 1992, Vietnam was essentially the equivalent of Liberia today. Very low income country, very rural agrarian. Roughly half of the food expenditures by farming households, so this is just farm producers in Vietnam, roughly half, even at that very low level, were purchased. So 50% auto-consumed, 50% or 49% purchased, 51 auto-consumed, meaning self-provision. But by 2016, one generation later, 80% almost of the food that these farming households, averaging about a hectare in rural Vietnam, the vast majority of their food was purchased. So markets are becoming salient at a very early stage to the nutritional status of even small farmers in low income and lower middle income countries. And we forget that at our peril, because markets matter a lot. The channels through which people access their food matters a lot, not just to the incomes they earn farming. One of the implications of that is there are a lot of people who need to get product, get food to people where they buy it. So very few people interact directly with farmers to purchase product, whether it's transport, storage, especially transformation, food service. The employment, the income effects that come out of the post-farm gate value chain are huge. A group of us published some estimates globally. Roughly 73% of the value added in consumer food expenditures globally comes post-farm gate. Put differently, roughly a quarter of the value of what the average consumer in the world is spending is flowing back to the farm. And that is shown on the left in this graphic. That's true even in middle income countries. That's true in India. It's true in China. So it's obviously true in the US. And this share falls steadily with economic development. What's perhaps less obvious, a group of us have a paper, we're doing proofs today or tomorrow for Nature Food, where we've built a global data set on employment and average compensation by industry, country, and year around the world, showing how jobs transition in the agri-food value chain. So those who are interested, the data set's available through the IFPRI Dataverse. But what you see here is the rapid decline in employment in primary production and how quickly people begin moving towards food service and retailing in particular, but equally the convergence in compensation across sectors, which you see on the right. And the key thing here is off-farm jobs pay better. They're safer and they pay better. So this transformation, leaving people leaving the farm and moving into the downstream processing and transport and food service and retail sectors leads to income growth, which also has nutritional implications, one that we haven't yet really studied very well. There's a real food price channel, and I'll skip through this because I think this is pretty familiar, but as agricultural productivity grows, you typically have, because of our natural satiation, our bodies can only absorb so much food intake. We're typically quite price inelastic in demand. So the result of that is that as the supply curve shifts, prices typically fall fairly steeply. Most of the gains that accrue from agricultural technological change in food commodities accrues to consumers as consumer surplus, much of it in nutritional form. So Bob Evanson and Doug Gollin established this long ago for the Green Revolution, and there's lots of other evidence behind this. But the key here is this is a real food price effect that enables consumers to just buy more given their income, and coupled with higher income allows for a choice of a more diverse diet. One thing we've spent less time looking at is technological change is not equal across commodities, and income and price elasticities of demand and cross-price elasticities of demand are not uniform across food products. So we're just starting to appreciate how differential investment in R&D, for example, in staple tubers and cereals, has probably preferentially advantaged starchy sources of calories, with the effect that the cost of vegetables, fruits, nuts, legumes for the average consumer has gone up appreciably compared to cereals-based products, which induces change in diet. And we know from, for example, David Atkins' work that exposure to low-cost diets creates a cuisine, a cultural effect, and people take that with them. As they migrate, they remain wedded to the diets that were affordable and familiar and preferred by their population with significant consumer welfare costs. So this habit formation effect helps to lock in the differential advantages. So an implication here is the need to reprioritize R&D. And we have some natural obstacles to perishables in general because of added cost in the value chain. But one implication here is continued pure focus on kind of staple cereals may not be adding much more at the margin to nutritional advances. Now let me just wrap up with the things where I think we really need to learn more. One of these is, as people diversify their diets, product quality matters a lot. But product quality is largely a credence attribute. Very few people have any idea what the nutrient content of their food is. And part of that's because very few people read the labeling, and the labeling is often not particularly informative. So one thing we know is that you have a series of trace minerals that are really important to human health and nutrition, iodine chief amongst them. I mean, many people don't know that the leading cause of preventable intellectual disability in the world is iodine deficiency still. It costs roughly a penny per day per person to iodize salt. It's incredibly cheap and very effective. Yet, most countries in the world do not have mandatory, including the United States, by the way, do not have mandatory iodine fortification of salt. This is at some level crazy. So the public policy implications of thinking carefully about where in the value chain is it best to improve micronutrient, mineral, vitamin content. Is it biofortification of germplasm so people grow crops that naturally have adequate zinc content, for example? Or is it industrial fortification? Or is it dissolving iodine in irrigation water? Because the iodine comes mainly from marine sources. I really encourage more work on thinking about these questions of where, especially post-harvest, it is most cost-effective for us to improve nutrition. And part of that then turns on the incentives for processors. Right now, some processing is hugely helpful to nutrition, like iodine in salt, or folic acid and zinc and iron in vegetable oils or flours. Some is literally life-saving. If we could get ready-to-use therapeutic foods into Gaza, you'd see a lot more Gazan young children surviving this current crisis. We can't, for political economy reasons, but this is literally life-saving food manufacturing. But an awful lot of it is not life-saving. It's adding things that appeal to our sensory receptors, make things smell good, look good, and particularly taste good, or it helps preservation. And many of those have very adverse health effects, adverse nutritional effects. So product standards helps, but they have to be enforced. Industry standards commonly long predate government standards. Josvinen has some nice work showing this over the years. This is an area where economists could usefully focus on what does it take to induce firms to do the right thing in terms of nutritional quality of food rather than adverse quality. The last two brief topics, one is public procurement. Governments are big buyers of food. Governments typically have statutory provisions to buy from the lowest price qualified bidder. I'm doing some work with the state of New York, which buys about $1.3 billion of food every year for schools, prisons, hospitals, et cetera. How do you get them to consider the spillover effects of the foods that they're purchasing? We've developed a tool that we think does this for economic multiplier effects, environmental spillovers, where there's a good scientific basis, a little bit on prison labor for some social justice and subsidization issues. It's much harder to do this for health and nutrition because a single food item doesn't tell us much about overall diet, and overall diet is what drives nutrition and health. But this is an area where we need to make progress because we need to leverage the power of large buyers to set standards that manufacturers then need to meet to get a big market, because the standards they meet in the processing for supplying a huge contract to the state of New York wind up being the standards they're using in the product that they sell through the retail value distribution system. So we can crowd in better behavior as the hypothesis, but frankly, we have no idea if this actually works. This is an area where I think there's a lot of possibility, especially in the developing world. And finally, risk management. We know that the frequency of intake of key micronutrients is really important to health and nutrition. We know there's a lot of seasonality in diets, although that's become appreciably less in the high-income world as pan-seasonal availability of fruits and vegetables becomes pretty universal. You know, a woman in a winter coat shopping for fresh citrus is pretty clearly not local citrus. So these marketing channels enable us to access key sources of micronutrients year-round. That's not universally true in the low and middle income world yet, obviously, but it's also important to recognize the important role that markets play in helping to smooth out the fluctuations people have in access to key nutrients. Part of this comes by just stabilizing incomes, because financial markets don't develop as fast as commodity markets do. And people turn to commodity markets in place of credit and insurance oftentimes. They sell when they need cash. And that enables people to smooth fluctuations. So Digvijay Negi at Ashoka University are doing some work on this in India right now. This too is an area where I think as high frequency data are emerging, the bank is really leading much of this, drawing out more on what are the nutritional implications of the intra-annual variation in incomes and occupational transitions will be very important. So just to summarize, market shifts have lots of implications through multiple channels: income channels, price channels, product composition, quality channels. as well as risk transfer channels. There's a lot of scope for policy relevant research there, especially in those latter topics I was raising. I really encourage, especially earlier career folks, this is an exciting agenda, and it's one where you have a natural audience of policymakers. They really do care about these health and nutrition implications of markets development. Thank you. I look forward to hearing the other speakers.
So next up is Will Masters, but just a quick reminder to our virtual audiences that you can submit your questions. There's a Slido link. Sorry, I keep calling it Sligo because there's a creek around here called Sligo Creek. A Slido link, and we will be monitoring those just like yesterday. So feel free to contribute your questions that way. Will, please.
Thank you, Ishani. This has been a treat of a conference, really. And Ishani asked me to follow up on Chris's overview and lead into Kathy and Kibrom's descriptions of social protection interventions and how those matter for people by thinking about how this work on the cost of healthy diets informs poverty measurement and the social protection response to that, as well as the agriculture nutrition kinds of changes that Chris talked about. So this comes from what's been for me 15 years of work, having moved from agricultural and development economics into a school of nutrition at Tufts University on the health science campus, surrounded by people who do nutritional biochemistry, who do clinical practice and dietetics, international nutrition, developing those ready-to-use therapeutic foods, sorts of things that Chris described, as well as people doing public health policy and messaging. So in 2010, I moved to this School of Nutrition, surrounded by these nutrition scientists, and began to do the work that's in the book that Chris builds on the review of the literature review that Chris mentioned, produced this book called Food Economics, Agriculture, Nutrition and Health, linking food supplies to the health outcomes that we see in high-income countries and low-income countries. And it, thanks to being part of a project funded by the Gates Foundation called the Global Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy, it is now the world's smallest book. So it's open access. On the book table over there, there's business cards with a QR code. If you're curious about this agenda, about thinking about agricultural and development economics, food systems in terms of health, that might be a helpful resource for you. One aspect of this agenda began 9 years ago when Yan Bai, who's now here in the room and at the bank, came from a career in banking and economics to think about food and nutrition and health outcomes, working with me and a number of colleagues, initially in Ghana and Tanzania, and then across East Africa, in colleagues in Malawi and Ethiopia, and then West Africa, Nigeria, work in South Asia as well, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and elsewhere, in India, to think about this project that we now call Food Prices for Nutrition, that matches the retail cost of the items at the end of the value chain that Chris described in terms of their nutritional composition and the health requirements for an active life over the lifespan. So development in utero, infancy, as Kibrom will talk about, intergenerational effects, and think about how those can be measured in this cost of healthy diets agenda. So by coincidence, next week, at this short URL, worldbank.org, Food Prices for Nutrition, that redirects to the Development Data Group's effort to take the available prices and construct an indicator of food security that correctly, as best this health science community can tell, reflects the requirements of a human being for an active and healthy life. So food systems and agroecological environments are drastically different around the world, but once people chew and swallow food, inside we're pretty darn similar, and have a set of health requirements that we now cost in this way. So this kind of new data has changed the conversation. This is Google Ngram's data, in which Google has violated copyright and scanned and digitized vast amount of English language, both professional documents, the gray literature, as well as books and journal articles, taking the frequency of these 4 or 5 word phrases compared to all other 4 or 5 word phrases. You can see on the left axis, these are very small shares of the total English language literature, says cost of healthy diets. It's not very much. But you know, from 2010s, early 2010s, like people were talking about this a little bit, but once we could measure it, people can really use it for the policymaking agenda that Marcus talked about in terms of the relevance of work to these stakeholders in government regarding social protection, agriculture, and health. So what do we do? So slide's a bit dense, walk you through it. This new data is called the cost of healthy diets because in the UN system agencies, they love acronyms. You might have noticed that. So in this political process of developing a metric that would reflect policymakers' desires, we ended up with this acronym, cost of healthy diets, COHD, focusing on access, whether the food system was making it even possible for people to meet their health needs, measuring access to a healthy diet in contrast to the actual foods that people consume. So prior price indexes, consumer price indexes, world trade, world food prices that measure commodity prices, those use very different kind of weighting systems. So you understand consumer price indexes is shared by actual expenditure. So there's sugar sweetened beverages and chips and all those foods. Food price indexes, producer price indexes, those are about bulk commodities. Then food security metrics do very different things. Since 1974, the FAO and UN agencies measure hunger through this prevalence of undernourishment metric that's based on a method introduced by great Indian statistician P.V. Sukhatme in the year I was born, 1961. So talk about influence of these great Indian economist statisticians, developing a metric to take these early food balance sheets and all the foods have actually produced and consumed, whatever they might be, and just add up, if they were distributed normally, would you meet the daily energy requirements? And that's now about 9% of the world population, according to that method developed by Sukhatme in 1961, then implemented in 74. Since 1995, USDA and then UN agencies, the FAO, have used this experience of food insecurity metric that asks people, did you go to bed hungry? Did you skip a meal? Did you eat less or other foods due to lack of resources to either grow or buy your own food? That's about 25% of the world population. What we do now is tracking, using economics in the context of a nutrition knowledge, to use economics to say, well, what is the least expensive that would allow people to meet their other goals, saving money for education, health, all their other goals as a household. If they were to meet their their nutritional requirements, what would be the least cost item by food group, as I'll show you, in dollars per day? So it's a price index calibrated to the heights and weights of people and how much you need of food per day. So since 2020, the World Bank and FAO began to develop these metrics. Since 2022, the current method is used. That's about a third of the world population cannot meet these needs. So you can see how we're moving towards a higher bar, defining food security closer to the aspirations of society as poverty reduction occurs around the world, and you can hope for something better into the future. So in particular, this is a metric developed in a health science context. It's a diagnostic metric. It's doing differential diagnosis to identify what are the causes of the poor diet qualities we observe. Is it high prices for these essential foods that you would need for health? Is it that prices are what they are, but incomes are too low to afford those? Or is it that these healthy items are available, but they're being displaced by other reasons, as Chris suggested, by the marketing of very attractive foods with convenience, with taste attributes, with the perishability, the packaged processed foods that are convenient, and so forth? What's going on to cause the poor diet quality? So what do? We tie the available data on locally available items being sold, match them to the food composition of that item in terms of food group requirements as specified in dietary guidelines. So on the right of this, you see the food guides, the pictures from the official government documents defining what a healthy diet is in a country from each of the UN regions, assembled to represent the concerns of policymakers and define a healthy diet as done by national governments in each UN region. For the SOFI 2020 document, the state of food security and nutrition in the world, formerly state of food insecurity, hence the acronym SOFI, we use the median cost of these 10 quantified guidelines, the ones you see on the right. For 2022, working closely with the development data group of the World Bank to ensure that it was reflecting accurately what the International Comparison Program individual item prices were showing, we introduced this healthy diet basket developed by my colleague Anna Herforth, a nutrition researcher, very close contact with the nutrition communities across the UN agencies, World Health Organization, UNICEF, as well as World Food Program and IFAD, to have consensus around a way to think about affordability that would work. National governments doing this monthly in each region of the country. Nigeria was the first. I'll show you those results. Malawi also uses this international standard, the healthy diet basket. Ethiopia, Ghana, Pakistan use their own dietary guidelines. You can see this method is flexible in responding to the needs of policymakers. This table shows you what this healthy diet basket consists of. There's 6 food groups, nutritionally defined. So in the category of starchy staples, for example, in many country data sets, you would find potatoes as a vegetable, but we classify that as a starchy staple. Similarly, in fruits, you might find tree nuts as a fruit, but we classify that as nuts and seeds. So there's a classification agenda here. There's a food composition agenda to make sure you're tracking the actual caloric value of these foods and the results. So our discovery is the red dots here. From low to high income, the cost of these least expensive items to meet a healthy diet is between $3 and $4 a day. So the total range is roughly a 2-fold variance, whereas the actual food consumption in the blue dots is much lower than that in the low-income countries. They could not possibly afford this healthy diet cost. But in high-income countries, middle-income countries, and higher-income countries, you see China and India, the large dots in the middle, at that inflection point where actual expenditure begins to exceed this minimum threshold, this minimum floor. To track affordability, this negotiated process of coming up with a metric of what would people need starts with these World Bank poverty lines for each income group. The UN agencies wanted to have that as their standard for what then non-food spending would be. So working with the Poverty Inequality Platform to get income distribution and ask what are the low income, the second quintile or the first quintile in some countries of people are spending on non-food shares, and that leads to the required non-food spending. You add that to the $3 to $4 a day and you get, could people afford a healthy diet? So what does this show us? Comparing the new to the old metrics of food security, what we find is unaffordability is just a much tighter metric from a development economics perspective. It's more closely aligned with what we kind of expect to see. It's a metric that is founded in fundamental biology and tracks some, it's based on some economic principles that turn out to give you a better metric. I'll jump over some of that comparison to show how it plays out in practice in Nigeria. So what you see is that Nigeria, National Bureau of Statistics, doing this with data from 2016, you get a very different picture when you look at these least expensive items for an overall healthy diet. Pre-COVID, these items in the Nigerian context, Nigeria was growing, these items stayed low cost. Then during the COVID period, you see the cost of a healthy diet rising at the same rate. And then during Nigeria's crisis period, when its banking crisis, its exchange rate crisis drove the price of these low-cost basic commodities through the roof, that led to just a huge sort of political crisis. And the statistician general of Nigeria, Prince Adeyemi, as a new statistician general in the new government, was very keen to publish the sort of best available sort of information about Nigerian economy for a variety of reasons. You see them doing this cost of a healthy diet. And this publication, a monthly bulletin about these low-cost basic items, you see the list there, was just enormously interesting for civil society to think about. In the bottom right, you see how this informed how trade unions were talking about what is a living wage. What does it mean to have a dignified life in the Nigerian context? You should be able to buy enough of these items on the left side of this picture in these quantities to feed a household. I want to just end by turning to sustainability. This economics approach of the least expensive items in these food groups to give you a benchmark access to a dignified diet turns out to be the least emitting items as well. Less land use, less feed for livestock and so forth, but not necessarily the least nutritious. So using these benchmark least cost diets does provide a sort of very interesting new idea about what is the food system doing. So just to conclude, about 1/3 of people in the world cannot afford this basket of items. That's because they're just more costly to grow and ship than basics. But even if healthy items are available, that doesn't mean people eat them. Many factors beyond health drive food choice, you can't tell. So even without the food system transformation, people overshoot on basically fried meat. I don't know if you ever tried it, but it's really good. And then, of course, switching to food service packaged foods, that's a huge other agenda of harms that Chris talked about. So calculating this kind of new indicator from the underlying prices that you get in the International Comparison Program or National Consumer Price Indexes, it reveals something very profound that's new, that's relevant, that's interesting. And having done this in close collaboration with the colleagues in the countries that I mentioned, has made a big difference in thinking about how innovation can work in these countries. What are the firms doing this kind of work? What are the regulatory environments that might matter? So I'll just conclude by saying this is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in collaboration with the UK government. And I hope you pick up a card about the book to see how this, in the context of other work, helps to think about how agriculture works for human nutrition, as you'll hear from Kibram at the end, intergenerationally, and from Kathy now. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. I'm honored to share this stage with my mentors and friends and collaborators. So today, perfect. So today I'll talk to you about intergenerational effects of shocks, focusing specifically on the early childhood stage. So my presentation will have two parts. The first part gives you kind of a broad overview of the literature, and then I'll spend a few minutes talking about my own work, which is on the 1983 to 1985 Ethiopian famine. Okay, so I have a very busy slide for you here. So to get us started, so this is an old, yeah.
No good conference without some technological glitches. I'm not going to stand here and tell jokes the entire time, but I did want to tell one, which is, just as a segue to Kibram's intergenerational transmission. P.D. Sukhatme reminded me I was actually taught development economics as an undergrad by his nephew, Vasant Sukhatme. So there you go. That's my joke. They're still looking for slides, but he'll be back.
You have only 1 minute left. Oh. Okay, so this is the updated slides I wanted to talk about today. So let me quickly move through it. Again, another busy slide. So by way of motivation, I'll start by saying that shocks experienced by individuals during the in utero period in early childhood can have significant consequences to themselves and their children. And this is especially the case in developing countries where we have market failures of all sorts, credit markets, insurance markets, and households lack resources for self-insurance. You can review Chris's several papers on credit failures and insurance failures in developing countries. The effects of shocks are transmitted through a variety of mechanisms, including biological, which covers kind of the health and educational aspects of exposure to early shocks, or behavioral elements in which parents or individuals who experience the shock invest less on education, and last, epigenetics, which covers kind of the genetic expression of heritable genetic features. So why does this matter? Exposures to adverse conditions in early childhood can impair health and economic outcomes throughout one's life, and it affects human capital accumulation and earnings in later life. When early life shocks affect especially the next generation, we're dealing with structural problems that persist across the generational line and lead to intergenerational poverty and inequality. So it's important to understand how early shocks affect generations within the generation and across the generational line. So let me first walk you through some of the canonical literature in this area. So Doug Allman's 2006 JP Journal of Political Economy paper is foundational in a sense that it kind of led to a wave of research in economics, public health, and demography on the importance of the fetal origins hypothesis. It also established that kind of exposure in early childhood, especially in the in utero period, can have long-lasting implications decades later. Case and co-authors link socioeconomic status to later life health and labor market outcomes. Allman and Curie's 2011 Journal of Economic Literature paper provides a comprehensive review of the literature on the fetal origins hypothesis, and more importantly, starts a new discussion on possible pathways, importance of stages in the developmental cycles that that are critical for the impacts of these shocks, as well as potential social policy interventions that could mediate the long-term impacts of early exposure. And a more recent paper by the same set of authors and their co-author Valentina Doki, so kind of update this entire literature on the early life origins of adult insults of human capital. So Tom Vogel is probably here, so I forgot to cite your paper here. So the evidence from the low middle income countries for the most part is primarily focused on generational impacts. For example, the very famous work by Martini and Yang, they show that rainfall in early life affects adult outcomes in Indonesia, and an important work by John Hodnott and co-authors show that nutritional interventions in Guatemala protect adult wage. Work by Balotra and Sonia Balotra and Venkatamani show that disease burden in India affects learning outcomes later in life. And our own work, actually, we have listened to Chris's suggestion earlier, and Will and I put together a quick paper a few minutes ago, and that's the last paper you see here. The Alamo and co-authors paper looks at the effects of iodine deprivation in early childhood on later life schooling and health outcomes. So I'll briefly talk about this paper. So in this paper, what we do is we use the Ethio-Eritrean War in late 1990s as exogenous source of variation to try and understand how deprivation of iodine in the early developmental stage affect later life outcomes. So basically, we combine a university entrance exam with soil iodine content. So to give you an idea of what this is, just a brief idea of what this is about, I want to go back to Chris's earlier point that iodine fortification is the cheapest way of getting iodine in human body. So during the war, Ethiopia lost its access to its single and only iodine fortification plant because of the war. So for a few period of years, so much of the soil that's available on the market was not iodized. As a result, humans at least during that period would have to rely on access to iodine through their food, which for the most part come from the soil. So we collected a sample of soil iodine content throughout the country, and we use that as exogenous source of variation to try and see how iodine in early stage affects later life outcomes. And we show in this paper that it affects the performance on high stakes university entrance exam. It reduces performance on that stage between 0.3 to 0.08 standard deviations, which is at the margin really, really important. As mentioned earlier, these studies are more generational long-term effects. These are different from intergenerational. Now there is a growing evidence on intergenerational effects of shocks. So the first paper I refer to here is the paper by Cheng and co-authors in China. They used the Chinese Great Famine from the 1959 and 1961 period to try and see how that affects later life outcomes. And they show that exposures to the famine during early development affects cognitive and school achievement of students, children, generations later. And a couple of papers by Caruso, who is here at the bank, and co-authors show that early exposure to natural disasters in Latin America lead to long-lasting effects. The biggest challenge in the developing country context is lack of data. So there isn't really a lot of work on intergenerational effects of shocks, and that's related to the lack of access to data, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. I have a bullet point that probably will make Talib a bit happy a little later. So what do we know about intergenerational effects of shocks? We know intergenerational transmission is most likely in the in utero period, as well as the first 100 roughly, which we usually refer to 1,000 days, which is the early childhood stage. And cognitive and educational outcomes are more sensitive than health outcomes, such as height, vertical height. We know there is now a growing evidence that there are gender-specific pathways with effects on girls having greater impact across the generational line than boys. And I should say here, the evidence on kind of males is relatively limited, but we have now a significant body of evidence showing that the effect primarily passes through women because of genetic expression at that stage. Timing and severity of the shocks matter, and social protection programs can play, social policy broadly defined, can play an important role in reducing the intergenerational transmission of shocks. As you will see in my own work next, intergenerational impacts are often muted because we're trying to measure effects across the generational line, and these tend to be generally very muted compared to direct and long-term effects. But the effects are bigger among marginalized populations with who lack access to infrastructure, for example, or groups that face repeated exposure to severe events. So I've briefly walked you through this throughout my discussion, but just to make it a bit more concrete, so the mechanisms for the intergenerational transmission of shocks include malnutrition or illness during the mother's early life. From now on, I'll focus on the mother because there is strong evidence on intergenerational shocks passing through mothers than fathers. And this affects physical stature and cognitive ability, impact these children. The effect on physical stature is relatively lower compared to cognitive effects. Lower educational attainment and non-cognitive outcomes, socio-emotional outcomes such as aspirations are among those affected by exposure to early shocks. Early research points to biological mechanisms such as epigenetic. The evidence is not solid yet, but there is now growing evidence that epigenetic change influence later life outcomes. And also there is evidence that mothers who experience trauma transfer psychological stress. This is new studies from Scandinavia show that stress gets passed on to the kid. Now, let me move on to my study. So this is a case study of the 1983-1985 Ethiopia famine. Ethiopia suffered a catastrophic famine during that time, which is generally considered to be one of the worst famines in the 20th century. And the peak of the famine was 1984. It primarily affected the northern provinces of Tigray and Wallo. It had broad geographic variation. So I use the geographic variation in the distribution of the famine and birth cohorts of parents to see how, if exposure to the famine affects the human capital outcome of children. So for this study, I used the Young Lives data, which tracks children who were between 6 months and 18 months at baseline in 2002 over 6 rounds. The last round is kind of a phone survey. The 5th round in the process of integrating. So today's presentation uses the first 4 rounds. So our outcome variables are health outcomes measured by height for age, Z-score, standardized test scores, schooling outcomes, schooling achievement, and socio-emotional measures such as loss of control and self-esteem. For channel of the transmission channel, we look at maternal height, education, aspirations, and expenditures. So this slide summarizes my finding in that paper. So I find significant intergenerational effects, a 1 standard deviation increase in the severity of the famine leads to a 0.08 drop in standard deviation drop in height for age. At the sample mean, this translates to a 5% drop in height for age for children born to mothers who experience the famine in utero or early childhood. Similarly, we find significant effect on statistically significant effect. Materially may not be as big, but statistically significant effect on children's years of schooling by approximately 0.05 grades. We find negative effects on locus of control, self-esteem, and test scores, standardized test scores, but these results are statistically insignificant. So we find, because the nature of the data is panel, so we're able to establish that the effect persists across rounds from infancy to adolescence. The transmission channel. So basically we find that mothers who experience the famine are shorter and they are less educated and they have low aspiration for themselves and their children, they have lower self-esteem and locus of control, but the latter outcomes are statistically insignificant. So we don't find anything across along the parental investment channel. So maybe our explanation is probably in the context we study, women are not the primary income earners, or marriage market outcomes may have mediated the effects of the shock. So policy implication, I want to start with the big picture. The big picture is data is a big problem in developing countries. So there has to be a concerted effort to invest on data infrastructure, such as the LSMS data that Talib and his team lead here at the bank. So it's just data that tracks individuals across generations is lacking in developing countries, and that has limited our ability to say much in terms of policy informing research. Specifically related to this study, we find prevention is more effective than post-shock remediation. Thank you. Thanks so much.
So, hi everybody. My name is Kathy Bayless. I strategically went after Kibram, who teed up a lot of the sort of motivation for what I want to talk about today, which are sort of various interventions to try and mitigate the effect of sometimes some of these shocks that children are susceptible to in terms of malnutrition. So anyway, it allows me to skip over a lot of the background discussion in my first slide. So thanks, Kibram. So I think I don't need to tell anybody in the room this. We've got a crisis in terms of malnutrition, undernutrition, sort of emphasized by Will's point that if a third of the population can't afford healthy diets, this is not something that's going to be solved overnight. So we've got, again, I'm going to particularly look at the manifestation of undernutrition in terms of stunting. And I think everybody in the room here knows the definition of stunting, sort of below 2 standard deviations of the median height for age. So about 23% of the kids globally are stunted, and that's a lot of people, right? And just to, again, riff off of Kibram's presentation, this can have long-run effects. It can have long-run effects on health, it can have long-run effects in terms of income, and it can have intergenerational effects. So again, this is not a short-run problem. And so in that yellow line there, that I don't know if you can see very well, but is percent of people that are stunted in the world. We've seen this, by the way, if we track food security, it looks very similar. We had this dip up until about 2015. We thought we were making good progress. I think I remember teaching world food security sort of in around that time and thinking, oh, pointing to this as a big success story in terms of reducing stunting, reducing food insecurity. But since then, we've seen an increase again, which is very disturbing. So what can be done? Lots of stuff. Obviously, this is malnutrition has been quite often the argument for a lot of policy interventions on the part of agriculture. I'm going to talk very briefly about that at the end. Happy to discuss that more, during the Q&A. But we've also seen a bunch of interventions in terms of social transfer. So Rima talked a bunch about this yesterday. Prenatal and early child support, including work by Ishani, and improved access to nutrient-dense foods. This has been a lot, particularly dealt with in the nutrition literature, so less in terms of evaluating programs on that front, but although there's some work there too, but a lot of work showing that, again, nutrient-dense foods can improve nutrition, can reduce stunting. But I want to talk about food transfers, partially because they tend to get less attention, but they're widely used globally. So this is all work from the World Bank, sort of highlighting that sort of more than 3/4 of low and middle income countries have some form of food transfer program. And this covers more than 1.5 billion people globally. So again, these are big programs, and we think they deserve to get some attention to. So we're going to look at India, which has the biggest of these. And so it also is facing some of the biggest problems in terms of malnutrition, right? So latest data is from 2020, where we saw, I think it's 35.5% of kids in India are stunted. That's been decreasing, but it's still quite high, right? And we're going to look particularly at India's public distribution system, which is, again, the world's largest food transfer program. It accounts for over 60% of the social assistance budget of India. So there's been lots and lots of work done on NREGA. And I remember when we were first sort of sending this paper out to places, people kept saying, why don't you look at NREGA? And it's like, well, a lot of other people have. And besides, it's much smaller. This is a much bigger program. It's what's, again, most important safety net during recent COVID. And what it does for folks, I know a lot of people in this room know the PDS program very, very well, but for those of you who don't, it basically gives a ration of staple cereals, rice and wheat, that are sold sort of below market price to ration card holders. And these are sold through a network of basically 500,000 fair price shops. So we're going to look at that in particular. We're going to try to ask a simple question, whether this form of food transfer program reduced stunting in India. So, and I'm going to try to convince you by the end of this that it did. So PDS improved nutrition, that it actually also had a knock-on effect of improving income, very similar to what we've seen with a lot of other sort of social transfers and also some conditional cash transfers. And that it also was reducing risk. So thinking of Chris's sort of 4 points about things that affect nutrition, we've got income, we've got prices. I can talk about that too. So there's some evidence it might have lowered food prices, particularly during bad weather shocks, risk, right? As well as, now this is sort of the one that might be surprising, sort of access to sort of more nutrient dense foods. So PDS has come under a lot of criticism, and both in terms of sort of whether it's been particularly effective. There's issues, there's always concerns about sort of corruption, there's concerns about quality of grains that are distributed through PDS. We heard from a lot of people said, oh no, we only send that, we use that for our chicken feed, basically, we wouldn't eat that, sort of the high quality grains kind of falling off the back of a truck, that kind of problem. There's also been a lot of concerns on the nutrition side saying, well, what you're doing is subsidizing basically empty, quote unquote, empty calories. And so we wanted to kind of dig into that a little bit. So what do we do? So we're going to use this big expansion of the PDS program under the National Food Security Act in 2013 in India. And what this did essentially was set national standards for what should be distributed, and the program itself up until then had really been the specific mandates had been determined at the state level. So in 2013, national level mandates now put in place, and the money was put behind that to try and encourage all states to come up to sort of a minimum standard of amount of grains. And particularly, some of the things they're doing was they changed the rules so that the amount of grains should be considered per person as opposed to per family. And it was specifically targeting sort of certain amounts of rice and wheat at certain prices. For identification purposes, this was sort of in a geeky econ way was helpful for us, because what that meant is that some states were already meeting these, but some states weren't. And those states that weren't had to come up to these guidelines. However, you also saw some states overshooting. You saw some states implementing this a little later, and you might worry that might introduce some endogeneity. There might be a reason why some states sort of did more than what was mandated. So what we're going to do is we're going to use an instrument where we basically say, what if all states had just complied with the national standards at exactly the time that were supposed to comply? And we're going to use that to instrument for sort of the variation in state compliance, if you like. Okay, so, and what we're going to also do is we're going to use the VDSA data that Chris sort of showed a graph of earlier, where we've got monthly level consumption data. We also have got specific household level ration card data, which is useful. So we know exactly what each household was supposed to be getting. Okay, all right. Let's go to the timeline. One thing to note is because these VDSA villages are rural and relatively remote, we're dealing primarily with the impact of PDS on stunting in rural households, okay? And also, this means that our baseline levels of stunting were pretty high, so around 38 to 40%, okay? So, jump right to the punchline. Apologies, too many tables. But if you look sort of at the top line there, so that's saying that for 100 rupee increase in PDS transfer, you'd be looking at a reduction in stunting of about 22%. The average increase that came because of this rule change in 2013 was about 30 to 35 rupees. So for a 30 rupee increase, we're reducing stunting by basically 7 percentage points, which amounts to about an 18% reduction in stunting. Pre-trends, because we have to show pre-trends, look pretty reasonable. We mostly found this effect in young kids. So to Kibram's point, I mean, when you're talking about the first 1,000 days of life, this is when we were seeing the effect largely. Our results are in line with sort of other work that had sort of looked at various interventions to reduce stunting. One thing to note is a bunch of the other work was really kind of only finding effects when you looked at behavioral change. So we're talking about food transfers, but also behavioral change, and they saw the behavioral changes kind of being some of the big effects. We're not looking at behavioral change, we're just looking at food transfers. Other results, well, we're not finding any effects on adult men. We don't find any effects on obesity. It's partially, again, we're working in a rural setting where obesity rates were very low. We do find some evidence of increased body mass index for adult women, particularly women of childbearing age, which, again, may suggest something in terms of birth weights. We're hoping to try and get into that. So I want to spend the last handful of minutes talking about why. So one thing is that we're actually seeing crowding in of other nutrient dense food. So basically what it seems to be happening is that people are taking the money they're saving on grains and they're using that largely on other foods. It's not going to talk time. I mean, it's a little bit, but not as much as you would expect from if you just gave people cash. Right. So in particular, we see sort of a big increase in terms of proteins, both in terms of lentils, like pulses, but also in terms of animal-based foods. And we also see sort of some increases in vegetable and oil, et cetera, consumption. So just to highlight there, so basically what we're seeing, so this is again for a 30 rupee increase, right, which was consistent with about the average level of increase that we saw due to the NFSA. We're seeing an increase in consumption of about 167 calories, right? Notably, only a third of that is coming from PDS grain. Most of that is coming from other foods. So there's something there. We are seeing sort of evidence of this kind of budgeting flypaper effect in terms of money that's allocated to the food budget is largely staying in the food budget, but getting reallocated to more nutrient-dense foods. The other thing we noticed was that we were seeing pretty large effects, and we were kind of trying to scratch our heads and say, what the heck's going on? And so we started to look at what was happening to people's wages. And we actually saw a notable increase in wages. We also saw a slight decrease in labor supply, but that was more than made up for by the increases in wages. These are largely, now notably, so when we dug into where this increase in wages coming from, it wasn't coming from salaried workers, as you'd expect. It was coming largely from basically short-term manual labor, particularly during climate shocks. So we also looked at this effect sort of for during rainfall shocks. And we saw sort of basically a more protective effect of PDS during rainfall shocks. So this is consistent with what sort of, Seema Jayachandra's paper in terms of selling labor low during sort of bad rainfall events. We're seeing that, and we're seeing this increase in PDS helping mitigate that. Okay, so conclusions. I think overall I think the implications were the implications are good, which is a little bit of good news in a period of not so great news. So we're finding the expansion did reduce stunting, biggest effect on young kids, did improve dietary diversity. And it had this sort of big second round effects in terms of wages and labor income. So that was sort of what we were finding there. Now, we know this is important, again, just to recap, because stunting can have these long run effects, intergenerational effects, right? And so finding policies that can help mitigate that is very important. We also know that stunting is expected to increase with climate change because of the increased amount severity of weather shocks, increased temperature, heat and humidity. Recent work from a grad student of mine was showing sort of five-fold implications in terms of when you take into consideration heat and humidity projections because of climate change versus just heat. So again, this is not a problem that's going away quickly. So we need to find interventions. Interventions are wide-ranging, right? And I'm just focusing in on one here in terms of food transfers, but we also know that, improving public health, improving sanitation, women's empowerment, access to nutrient-dense foods. There's lots of other interventions that are useful here. So I don't want to say food transfers is the only answer. I also want to note that food transfers aren't a panacea, because they can have, you worry about implications in terms of long-run agricultural production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. But in general, because we're seeing these knock-on effects, or not only, but particularly because we're seeing these knock-on effects in terms of labor incomes, I think these kind of social protection programs can be really important in this context, right? And there's a nice piece done by McGovern et al. That sort of went and actually looked at sort of the cost effectiveness of some of these interventions in terms of stunting, and found that that the cost benefit ratios were huge. So long story short, I think this deserves a lot of sort of attention, work on the policy front, and happy to entertain questions. Thanks so much.
Right, as the panelists get settled in, can I just see a show of hands for questions in the audience? Okay, all right. Let's get a mic over to Tom.
I wanted to ask Will about implications for this index, for this new food cost index, for thinking about nutritional poverty traps. I guess I was taught in graduate school that we used to think short-term nutritional poverty traps could be an important thing, and then we figured out that calories were really cheap, and so they couldn't possibly be a real thing. And I wonder if incorporating more aspects of nutrition than just calories can lead us to think more richly about the problem.
So in the interest of time, we'll go a little bit over, given the slightly delayed start and the technical glitches, but no more than 5 to 6 minutes into the coffee break, Shannon, I promise. So let's do a question here. And then were there any others at this time? Okay.
These seem such important results that I was wondering how you marketed them down to the people who most need them. I noticed one of you said that Google had started searching your acronym, but was it doing that to distribute the knowledge from that to the people who need it, or maybe to big food manufacturers who may not actually use it the way you want it used?
And then in the back, Christina had a question as well.
Sorry, another question for Will. In terms of, you talked a lot about the different kind of nutritional requirements. How does this factor into in terms of total caloric demands? And does that vary at all by kind of modal job requirements? Yeah, does it vary at all by expectation of how much exercise will be needed on the job?
Thank you. Okay, we'll come back for more. So Will, why don't you start us off? That the question in the middle, about sort of reaching policy audiences, I think I'd love to hear from all of you briefly.
Yeah, so quickly, Tom's question about nutritional poverty traps. One really fascinating thing is that we do find pretty continuous response to improved circumstances, whether it's magnitudes of social protection cash transfers, product transfers like the PDS, rainfall shocks, other kinds of metrics. We find pretty continuous response, actually. So we don't see those threshold effects that you would think of as a trap, really. In terms of the question about data flowing to decision makers, we do have a pretty robust pipeline to governments now, I think, in terms of engaging with governments on these kinds of data. Of course, the underlying data flows are pretty limited. But one thing we're trying to open up is the dialogue with food enterprises. So what Chris described as the agenda with respect to the economics of firms about incentives to improve nutritional quality. And then Christina's point about total caloric demand. So that's mostly heights and weights. Physical activity is very important. And as far as we can tell, there are individuals and households who are doing these 5,000, 6,000 calorie days, like that athlete in your college cafeteria with the 2 forks, eating 2 plates of food because they've just been doing, 4 hours of football practice. There are individuals and households doing that, but most individuals, even in low-income agrarian settings, are not actually doing that. And so most of the variance in total caloric need is just heights and weights. It's a really striking phenomenon about the world. And there's a new PNAS paper showing that using energy expenditure from what's called doubly labeled water, that even in agrarian households, that total metabolic activity on average for people at least who were studied, there's not that many of those 5,000, 6,000 calorie a day. There are, of course, some people do need to do that. The famous Heather Schofield work on rickshaw drivers and other professions. But for most people, it's heights and weights that drives total energy needs.
Kathy, did you want to go next on reaching policy audiences?
Yeah, just very, very briefly. So we and by we, I really mean my co-author colleague Aditya Srinivas, who's at IIM Bangalore right now. Anyway, he's been chatting a fair bit with some of the folks in the Indian government to try and highlight this. We've also done a number of sort of local popular press things in India to try to bring this forward. But yeah, it's a very good point.
There's actually, if I can just jump in on that, yesterday, after the conversation moderated by Indermeet, there was an online question that came in a little too late, but that asked about budget allocation to NREGA, for instance, in the PDS, which have sort of, at least in real terms, taken quite a sizable hit. So, it's really important to reach the government with that sort of work. Kibram.
Okay, the mic's on. So in terms of policy, what comes out of our work relates to the importance of social protection programs. So prevention is the best way of preventing, avoiding intergenerational transmission of shocks. And given the instruments we have, social protection programs or social safety nets are ideal in terms of being able to kind of mitigate the effects of early exposure. But social safety nets are expensive. So there has to be serious engagement with government counterparts, and probably the World Bank can have a significant role. Finance is a big issue for developing countries, so the World Bank can come in and maybe help institutionally set up social safety net programs, which I should mention have been growing in much of the developing world following the COVID-19 crisis and the impacts that social countries with social protection programs experienced from having them in place before the crisis hit. So that's the direction we're taking.
Yeah, so I guess two different points. One, I'd like to have a friendly disagreement with Will on Tom's great question about, are there nutritional poverty traps? I think the evidence on calorie-based poverty traps is pretty compelling, and you explain the narrative quite well. We don't really know much about micronutrient-based poverty traps. What we know from the public health literature is there are really important irreversibilities. Xerophthalmia, night blindness due to insufficient vitamin A intake, isn't reversible. Children who suffer xerophthalmia will have permanent night blindness. It's one of the reasons why the public health community invests a lot in vitamin A drops. We know that cretinism, the old language for severe iodine deficiency, causes irreversible loss of cognitive function. That's why the public health community invested so much in the 1930s and 40s in this country to identify the etiology of cretinism in the US population and to push hard for salt iodization. These threshold effects are one thing one looks for in poverty traps. I mean, but another is an irreversibility of state. And we do know from the public health literature that there are irreversibilities of state associated with some micronutrients. What we have no idea of is what is the right interval of time and the right level of intake. So we haven't found these thresholds yet, but we know from the health literature that they exist. So I think that's a really important question to probe, and it gets at a whole host of issues, including nutrient composition tables. We actually know surprisingly little about the true composition of people's diets, because nutrient composition tables are means from old samples in very specific places. And nutrient composition, especially of trace minerals, varies a lot based off of weather conditions and soil conditions. So we are using quite poor data to try to get at these hard to find effects in small elements in diets. But the gateway for policy engagement on this, I think, is twofold. One is safety nets, where government obviously plays a lead role. But we can't forget that the vast majority of the food people consume is coming through the commercial distribution system. No matter how poor you are, with a few exceptions, people in refugee and IDP camps, et cetera. I mean, poor people are primarily getting their diets supplied through the commercial food distribution system in their own production. If we don't figure out how to productively engage the commercial food processing and distribution and food service sectors to provide healthier food that is affordable, we will not make much progress on nutritional outcomes. They can be a force for good, they can be a force for bad. We can get salt iodization, or we can get Big Macs. And I really think a big task for economists oriented towards policy is, how do we induce more of the former type of intervention from firms that are thinking about profits, not the good nutrition of poor people?
Thank you. Bummer about your thoughts on the nutrient composition tables, because we have been, the Bennett's Law paper that you mentioned, we've just grown it dramatically using nutrient composition tables, but we do what we can with the data we have. Okay, so we have time for two very quick questions. One was over here. Did you? Okay. And then across the aisle. And please be very quick, or I will cut you off. And I have shown that I will cut people off, so.
Thank you, great panel. The incidence of stunning is just increasing with pulley crisis, and that's something that we need to pay more attention to. So Katie and Chris would like to hear your thoughts in terms of, like, when pulley crisis happens, particularly like the market's availability of foods goes down. From some of my own work in Afghanistan, like, we see households that are agricultural livestocks, they're better safe. Obviously, nutrition-wise is low, but they have something to eat. So, like, thinking in terms of accessibility to the market and pulley crisis situation, how can we better think moving forward in addressing stunting across different practices?
Thank you. And if you could just pass it across the aisle.
Yeah, actually, my question is pretty short. I just want to hear the panelists talking about a little bit on overnutrition issues, because today we're talking about nutrition, but overnutrition obviously is one of the most important and also very quickly increasing problem in the world, especially in the low-income countries. So just on the comments, I think especially for Kathy, this question about interventions and overnutrition. Thank you.
Just on that very quickly, to note that there is also a well-documented link between early life malnutrition and later life predisposition to diseases that are often labeled overnutrition related. Maybe let's go in, why don't you start?
So no, great question, and I admit, so we partially given the nature of the data that we're looking at, which is primarily in rural areas, we punted on the sort of and we looked briefly at sort of effects in terms of obesity and overweight, and just we're finding nothing. I think there's, I mean, other than Ishani's point that we do know this relationship between sort of early childhood malnutrition and sort of longer run sort of issues in terms of, sort of overnutrition, I guess. Long story short, I don't have too much to to say. So let's see. And your question was about stunting and sort of market access stuff. So I mean, one thing we do see evidence for is that if you've got places that are very disconnected from markets, right, and you see sort of local weather shocks, and therefore you see sort of relatively high local price shocks, that can precipitate stunting. And so, I mean, I've done a little bit of work in that area, but many other people have done a lot more. So, I mean, that would be certainly suggestive that helping improve market integration would be useful. Also, in terms of just us getting farmers access to things like early maturing seed varieties, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, I think there is suggestive work there around that, but I'm curious to hear Chris's response.
Market integration, love that. Chris, 30 seconds, Will, 30, and then Kibram.
Yeah, so I have very little to add what Kathy said, other than in conflict settings, really the crucial thing is the political economy of humanitarian response. Markets work. There are traders who will always find their way into even active conflict zones, but people are increasingly dependent upon social safety nets and humanitarian response. And as we see today, that's driven much more by politics than economic analysis of where there are high returns to spending from the public purse.
Yeah, so first on stunting. So stunting has been a tremendously valuable indicator of the degree to which people have been able to attain their genetic potential, largely thanks to the demographic and health surveys that sadly are under threat, perhaps ending now. But we now have metrics of actual dietary intake. We have metrics of biomarkers whose cost of data collection has come way down through these low burden surveys to see what people ate in the past 24 hours or the last 7 days. So that's giving us even more granular information about nutritional, sort of ongoing nutritional status. So in collaboration with dietetics and understanding food intake, we're getting a more nuanced picture. It turns out that stunting is partially, of course, affected by dietary intake, but also by many other things. Then on overconsumption, it's this idea of a balanced diet, a Goldilocks diet, in which we're identifying these different food categories, nutritional food groups, where people overshoot in some and therefore underconsume in others, and where there are entire categories that you should moderate to sort of less than 10% or so of your dietary intake in order to have an overall balanced diet. So those are two really important things about kind of data collection and these metrics that in the past 5 years, I would say, have changed quite dramatically thanks to the understanding that's generated by this nutrition science community. Thank you.
So I'll just add a couple of points on Ishani's earlier point to your overconsumption issue. So basically, we know from the literature that because of metabolic adaptation to early undernutrition, this overconsumption is kind of a later life consequence. So it's just a reflection of basically having to kind of the need to intervene early. So during lack of nutritious food, if you intervene, you avoid this later life or overconsumption issue.
Thank you. All right, that was a very rich discussion. These folks are all giants in the field of agriculture and nutrition economics. Kibram is one in the making. So thank you very much for making the time to be here. I really appreciate it. It's a real pleasure and honor to share the stage with you. We're going to take our one coffee break until we break for lunch. So be sure to fuel up, and we'll be back in 20 minutes. Thank you. That's what I did. That's fine. All right, folks, if we're still lingering on the sidelines, let's have a seat, please. Wrap up any conversations. Okay, great. So we are going to get started on our last panel of ABCDE 2025, which is on migration. This will be moderated by my colleague, Danny Bahar, who is a senior fellow and the director of the Migration, Displacement, and Humanitarian Policy program at the Center for Global Development. Right after that, we'll go to a fireside chat, but I'll be back to introduce that.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Friday weekend is coming, but not before we talk about this very interesting and exciting panel that we have. And I'll just, as a moderator, I'm going to also take advantage of framing a little bit the conversation, because we're going to try to have more of a conversation on a topic that you know, it's a lot of people has a lot of opinions on, and the idea is to really bring this down to evidence and try to think forward about the importance of this topic for development at large. So I call a little bit the frame of this the next big shift in the world, and I want to start by claiming that the demographic imbalance, the global demographic imbalance, is probably the most pressing and neglected issue in the world that we have today. There's many other pressing issues. I think many of them people are aware of, have opinions on, but I think the demographic imbalance is one that is kind of under the radar. There's the metaphor I like to use is that there's two things happening at the same time underneath that we're not even appreciating much. And one of them is an earthquake. It's like the tectonic plates are moving in the world. And a slow earthquake is happening because in many, mostly developed countries, also middle-income countries, populations are aging really fast. Fertility rates have dropped below replacement rates. And we are beginning to experience labor shortages that are going to keep these countries from just fulfilling the natural economic growth that they've been seeing if these shortages are not fulfilled somehow. So in those countries, we have a situation of jobs without people. But in developing countries, South Asia, Africa, of course, we have a little bit of a volcano that is about to erupt, where there's abundance of young people ready to work without enough jobs. So there we have people without jobs. And of course, part of the framing here is that that seems to be a very obvious problem to solve on paper, but maybe not on practice. And I don't think this is moving. Okay. This is an example of what I'm saying that comes from actually the WDR of 2023, with Jalar was one of the lead authors. He's also accompanying on the panel. And here you see very clearly an example of a developed country, Italy, and a developing country, Nigeria, and how their pyramids of population are completely almost the opposite, yin-yangs. And the projections are, you also have their projections until 2050. So it's kind of obvious. This is kind of a proof of a little bit of what I was saying of the earthquakes and the volcanoes. And one of the things that I claim that this is the most pressing issue, because these labor shortages are challenges that are transversal across a number of other critical issues. Are transversal in terms of the energy transition, because there's just not enough electricians to install solar panels if that's what countries want to do. There's just not enough nurses to deal, for public health challenges that we have in developed countries. And we're talking about AI. There's just not enough talent or skills to be able to supplement the infrastructure that developed countries need in their race for AI. So this is not just one issue, it's a transversal issue across all other elements that are critical for the global economy. And a little bit the framing of this panel is gonna be, is labor migration a feasible solution, a possible solution, maybe one of many, or in these times, particularly these times of populism? The last thought here is that I also want to claim that the clock is ticking, because some of the irregular migration that we have seen in many places in the world could be part of this imbalance, actually. So we talk a lot about a lot of determinants, but I just sharing with you a couple of graphs from a paper that I completed last year, in which I was looking particularly at some of the determinants of the border crossings here in the US over the past 25 years. So this graph is showing in a year-over-year difference, so it's taking out the seasonality of the series of all the border crossings in the southwest border of the US since 2000 until mid last year. And I'm gonna put on this graph another variable, which is the labor tightness of the US during that period, which is how many vacancies there are per each unemployed person in the US. And this is how it looks. That correlation is strong. Of course, you see here in the last 5 years where those numbers went up significantly, the border crossings. Also, labor market tightness was reached about 2 according to this data. So there were essentially at some point 2 vacancies per each unemployed person in the US. And if many of you remember, walking around any city in the US, there were help wanted signs everywhere. In hotels, there were not enough workers. In construction, there were not enough workers. So what I'm gonna claim is that this is the beginning of this. What we're seeing is part of the beginning of this earthquake that is happening. So therefore, it needs to be addressed. So we're going to try to explore in this panel some of these questions. Is migration one of the solutions to this imbalance? Maybe there's other solutions. What are they? What policy instruments are available to make this a win-win-win situation? We're going to talk about skill building, credentials, financing, pathways. And we're also going to revisit the long-old question about the brain gain versus the brain gain, because we also want to make sure this is a win-win for developing countries. So we have really the most fantastic panel that we could have had. So we have Caroline Theoharides, who is associate professor at Amherst College. She's the global scholar expert on brain gain, with many publications, in particular one I would recommend in Science magazine very recently, summarizing the literature. So we're really pleased to have you. Andrew Seeley, a good friend, and also the president of the Migration Policy Institute, who has been at the frontier of both academia and policy work on this matter. And of course, the World Bank's very own Jalar Ozen, also a good friend, who's now the deputy chief economist of MENA here at the World Bank, who's a leading scholar on everything that has to do with migration. So Jalar, why don't you come and then we'll have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. It's great to be here, and I'll echo Danny. Thank you for being here on a Friday on an interesting topic, at least two of us. Okay, I cannot see half of my PowerPoint, so I apologize. But I'll look there. All right. So what I'm going to talk about, Danny kind of built the pathway, so I'll start there. But I want to start with the following. Last night during dinner, Dion mentioned the 1984 World Development Report that Nancy Birdsall did on demography, and which embarrassingly so I didn't know about it. I said, well, I was in elementary school at the time, but nevertheless, I should have known about it. But it really, so last night I sat down and read through it, and it was remarkable how much the world has changed. I mean, other than the art cover of the WDRs, I think that's one of the few dimensions we have improved. And anyway, so the 1984 WDR basically was about two things. It was, you know, the fertility population growth rate is way too high in developing countries, and that's a problem. It impacts growth. We really have to worry about it. And we are so proud of South Korea because they lowered fertility rate to 2.1, right? The shocking thing there in the WDR, there was the implicit assumption that fertility rate can never fall below 2. There are all these long-term projections, and as if there's a line that fertility rate cannot go down. I'm going to get back to that point quickly, and how much the world has changed in 40 years since 1984. And this is, the whole thing has almost shifted. And at the time, also in 1984, the fertility rate in high-income countries was also around 2. And they're saying, see, this is fantastic. That's why they're wealthy, and that's why they're going to stay wealthy. All right. So Danny put this, this is from the WDR. But I'm going to say the shocking and important thing is not Nigeria or Western Europe. It's actually Mexico here. The biggest shock is what happened to Mexico, because vast majority of the world's population lives in middle-income countries, and the rapid decline in fertility and the rapid aging, if the middle-income countries, it's the biggest actually threat, I'm going to argue here. We knew what was going to happen in high-income countries, even in 1984. We kind of knew what was happening, although the fertility decline in low-income countries has been faster, but still we kind of kept the shape. But the big shock happened in the middle-income countries. So if you look at it, this is the US fertility decline. So the bump during the war years, you know, people have a way of smoothing out everything, including income and number of children. But it took almost 200 years for the US fertility rate to decline from 6 and 7 to replacement. Now look at what happened in a range of middle-income countries. Even India today is below replacement. I'm Turkish. In Turkey, it is 1.4. Nobody has expected it to decline that far, that fast. Now, there's the phrase associated with China becoming old before becoming wealthy. It is not about China. It is about pretty much every middle-income country we know. That decline. And at the same time, the US income, depending on how you calculate it, intermediate left, the growth rate, like 30, 40 times income growth in the US in the same time period, it is significantly less in all these countries, right? You're seeing the rapid decline. Now, and you also, when we put this is the inverse dependency ratio, working age to elderly, and you're seeing even the low-income countries, like this year, today is where we are falling off the cliff, right? You're seeing how rapidly it's going to start falling, even in low-income countries. And the most important one, the upper middle-income countries are basically rapidly converging to high-income countries, right? Now, why is this important? So if you look at the dependency ratios in high-income countries, middle-income countries, and low-income countries, you're seeing this pattern, and the middle-income countries are basically starting to pick up. High-income countries already did, but the remarkable thing is the following. If you look at the world today, the whole world, we are in this remarkable era of stability. It has never happened in human history since we started collecting data that we have a fixed, stable, almost 40 years of basically stable dependency ratio. The problem is this is going on its own. I'm not clicking. Is one of you guys doing it? I mean, I understand I have 20 minutes, 15 minutes, but don't rush me. All right. So this era of stability, we are smack in the middle of it, right? 2025 is right there. And this is a great opportunity of demographic arbitrage. We've been saying this, okay, 10 minutes, saying this for a long time. The issue, obviously, the young people are in one place, where the jobs, this is what Danny said, where the jobs are needed in another place, and migration is the optional, optimal choice, but it doesn't end there, and that's because of flying. So, side point, all this stuff where we are today, I'm going to put part of the blame on the UN population division's overestimation of fertility rates. This is their errors. This is the data they used in the 1984 WDR. Do you see how much off they are, for example, in the case of Thailand, for young people? They almost overestimated by 80%. They underestimated the rapid fertility decline. And all of our projections and our planning is based on these fertility declines, and we completely overestimated the world population. So if anything, Mamta, this is one thing I think the World Bank has to go back and looking at the demographic transition as an economic issue, not just some sort of mechanical issue where automatically declines, but at a relatively low rate. All right, now, this is what the world is going to happen. We all know sub-Saharan Africa is going to increase. South Asia is increasing, although fertility has gone down because people are living longer, right? Everywhere else, actually, we're seeing a shrinkage of labor force. So this is a back of the envelope exercise we had done. If you want to maintain 2.5 working age people per each elderly retiree, this is how many people you're going to need by education, right? Now, the second problem is the following. Historically, if you look at the post-war migration patterns, it's a middle-income country guy like me going to a high-income country person, right? This applies to pretty much half of us in this room. That has stopped because the middle-income countries have run out of people. This is Mexico, this is Turkey, this is Morocco, this is Philippines. It is not there. These middle-income countries, for a variety of really successful development initiatives, not at the level we have, but we want, but still there, they have decent education systems, right? There's mandatory 12-year education in Mexico and Turkey, and the periphery countries, these migrants, they are the ones who supply the migrants to the high-income countries. That has stopped. Where you have the excess people and where you need them, including the middle-income countries, there's a huge education gap. So what we're talking about, this whole labor market thing, is not just about the number of people missing, it's the education, the human capital that's missing. So you cannot have a migration policy or labor market policy without an appropriate education intervention in the rapidly growing countries. That was one of the messages of the WDR. So in a sense, I always say the 2023 WDR was as much about education as it was about labor mobility, right? Now, if you look at it, this is the high income countries, how many people you're going to need, and possible policy interventions, right? So suppose we increase the labor force participation of women, we go a little bit, we increase the elderly labor force participation, push the retirement age, and we increase migration way more than what is currently. But you see, migration actually, sadly enough, does not really solve the problem in high income countries and also in China. But in the Chinese case, it's at a low base. So take it with a grain of salt. So we still have a huge remaining labor force gap in upper middle income and high income countries. Now, if you look at the low income countries, there's a shortage of the highly educated, tertiary educated people. There's a slight surplus. India, again, like China, bucks the trend. So it's good to take out India from the analysis because they're so big and the trends are different. But this is what you are seeing, right? There's a surplus of labor, but they are not educated. All right. Now, when we actually put the whole thing together, you're seeing the numbers are actually pretty good. This is why we have that stability, the demographic window of arbitrage there. All right. Now, let's come to the education. I'm going to wrap it up very quickly. This is where we are. Upper middle income countries have done remarkably well. The whole world has done remarkably well with primary education. We are at almost 100% everywhere around the world. Part of the credit goes to my education colleagues in the bank because we have done a very decent job there. But look at secondary and especially tertiary enrollment. You're seeing upper middle income countries are converging to high income countries, but That is not the case for lower middle income and especially low income countries. They're actually stabilizing, if you look at the trends in data, at really suboptimal levels. So we need more funding, and not necessarily for tertiary education. Remember, the shortage actually in high income countries are the middle educated people, especially in vocational training. US and Europe have no problem actually educating the tertiary. We are doing much better. It's the vocational and secondary education that we need, especially in low income and low middle income. Now, a potential solution, this was a follow-up report we did with the SBJ colleagues on global skills partnerships. Now, there's this whole debate about migration. There are tons of different types of migration, whether it's forced migration or whether you name it, right? It's a continuum. That was the framework of the WDR. So I'm going to talk about a small portion where we can address this issues, the demographic and the education mismatches, gaps between where the people are and where the jobs are. So here it is. GSP, for those of you who don't know, is a very simple idea. It says basically Germany needs nurses. And the German standards of education and professional, whatever, licensing are such that it's not easy to, convince the German authorities to grant licenses to people, even if they're coming from Italy, say. So we convinced the Germans to basically open a nursing school in Senegal. They train 1,000 people. Half of them, whatever portion you agree, stay in Senegal, and the rest come to Germany with the proper German licensing, with proper legal pathways, and with the proper human capital. Senegal gains because they have 500 extra nurses, properly trained by the Germans, and the Germans gain because they have now more nurses that they have trained according to the criteria of their labor market needs and licensing requirements. Now, the devil is, of course, in the details. I have 3 minutes. The details are that you need 22 ministries in both countries to agree on this, from the foreign ministry to the finance, to the education, to the labor, and it becomes a nightmare. This is where the World Bank actually enters the picture. This is our value added, smoothing out the bureaucratic mess. The SBJ unit has actually active between 8 and 14, depending on how you counted GSP programs, but that's where you can address all the concerns from brain drain to legality of migration, right? Now, the important thing, I'm going to start from the other side, the legality, because they're coming under legal pathways with the proper licensing. So presumably all the burdens on Germany is taken care of in that process because it's a bilateral agreement. The second one, it's the firms, the employers have a stake in this, right? So it becomes sustainable and scalable. And the most important thing is it's a bilateral agreement, and it doesn't impose necessarily a big financial burden on Senegal, and kind of the markets take care of it. And example, the Australians started this program in Pacific Islands. It was just a vocational training program. They did not think of it as a migration, actually, but then they realized all these people, now that they had Australian training back at home, the employers in Australia were easily hiring them, and then the officials in Tonga and Papua New Guinea got really upset. We thought you were going to educate our people to work here, and now you're stealing them. And Australians said that wasn't our intention. But the market somehow way of fixing things, so Australians actually doubled down and expanded it rapidly, and it has been very successful. Unfortunately, a lot of the other GSP programs, pilots, have not been as successful. They stayed as pilots, partly because of the 22 ministries getting involved, and partly because COVID intervened in a lot of the cases. But I want to end with this. A lot of my presentations, I have slides from football. And actually, after the Bosman rule in the European leagues, where you had free mobility of football players, a lot of the European football clubs opened up academies in West Africa. These are boarding schools. They take 200, 300, 400 young boys, give them proper high school education, and at the same time train them for football. Around 10% go to leagues in Europe. That finances the whole operation. Around another 20% play football at home, and 70% don't even play football, but they end up with high school education, which they would not have. There's no government involvement, completely private sector. This is what you see when the skills are transferable and when there is legal pathway opportunity. Then everybody benefits from it, except the couple of the European football players now who are placed out by the Africans who are coming there. All right, thank you so much. And I think I did okay in terms of time.
Good morning, everybody. Oh, good. Okay, great. I know it's hard on a Friday morning here. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Danny for the invitation. I'm going to repeat a little bit of what both Danny and Shaglar have already said, but I will then go into a bit of some of the policy considerations here going forward. Demography is going to necessitate movement. It's going to drive movement. And you saw two different examples. You saw one way of doing this in a healthy way, right? Thinking about how we could actually plan for mobility in ways that help the source countries as well as the destination countries, right? Now, you'll hear more about this shortly as well from the next speaker. And you also saw, even though Danny didn't dwell on it, but you saw in his slide there, the number of people who move through irregular channels across the US border when the economy is there. I mean, the bottom line, if you take those two, is people are going to move, right? We actually have we're living in a time where there will be labor market openings, there will be opportunities, there will be a pull factor for people to come, not just to the United States, but to other countries, to a lot of middle-income countries as well. And unless we think about how we build the legal channels, which Tyler finished here, to move through which people can move, people are going to move through irregular routes, right? But we should assume that the future has a lot of mobility, and much more than we've seen in the recent past. And it's not just the United States and Canada and Western Europe and Australia and East Asia and sort of the obvious ones that got there first with low birth rates. We actually just literally have a book that's about to come out as an advanced copy on migration policies in Latin America and the Caribbean. This was with 3 colleagues of mine. And much of the last 15 years in Latin America and the Caribbean has been movement because of displacement crises, Venezuela, Haiti, Nicaragua. But where we end the book actually is saying this is not likely to be the future, right? This has been the past. The future conversation is going to be about labor mobility. And there'll be a handful of countries, Honduras, Guatemala, Haiti, that people will be leaving still, where there'll still be surplus labor. But there's going to be lots of countries like Mexico, like Brazil, like Colombia, already Uruguay and Barbados, Bahamas, where there are real labor needs. Guyana, oddly enough, which was one of the countries that had lots and lots of people left, which suddenly will be looking for workers abroad, right? And no one's noticed it yet, for the most part, except for Uruguay is talking about Barbados, but most are not talking about it yet because displacement crises have actually taken up the conversation. Same thing in Turkey, right? But in the end, this is the future conversation that's coming. Of course, you could say technology will make a difference. Some jobs will disappear. That's almost certainly true. The workforce of the future is not the workforce of the past. But what we know, for those that lived through the 1990s, and we heard that all the jobs would disappear and that everything were going to be replaced by robots and the internet and all that, what we also know is productivity increases also generate new kinds of employment. It is certainly possible that there will be fewer workers. There'll also be fewer workers on the planet eventually. But it's also very likely that in many countries, what you're going to see is perhaps, you're seeing this in Japan, for example, getting by with fewer workers, but you will also see lots of other jobs that are created also by aging populations, for example, care work. So in many countries, what we see is what we see in the United States. And I'm going to make a political but nonpartisan comment on this, which is in the US, we tend to zigzag between allowing people in through irregular channels to meet our workforce needs and then shutting down and then going back to figuring it out. There are a few countries that have more or less gotten this right. And by getting it right, what they have done is both figure out legal pathways to meet workforce needs. They've thought about immigration policy as part of their economic and labor force policy. But they've also made sure that there's not a lot of irregular migration, because irregular migration, what it does is undermine the credibility of immigration systems. And I'm not surprised that a lot of people were actually turned off by the number of people that came across the border, not because they're bad folks, because they actually, as I always point out to people, the folks that came across the border are likely to be contributing members of American society. Their kids will be great Americans, But because when people see that there isn't a selection system for people coming, it undermines the public's willingness to support legal pathways. So we need to see a future where we can do both of those. In some countries like Canada and Australia and New Zealand, granted they're all de facto islands, real islands are de facto island. Canada, anyone's Canadian, no offense, but de facto island. To have been good both about making sure there's limited irregular migration, a little easier when you're an island or you got the US as a buffer, but still, and at the same time been proactive on building legal pathways. And we're starting to see this happening in some other countries. Italy. You wouldn't think of Italy with a government that is often seen to be on the populist right would be doing this, but actually has been very intolerant of boat arrivals, but has actually passed one of the most ambitious labor migration reforms in the past 2 years. Spain, which actually has a lot of migration control, they're the opposite. They don't talk about that part, but they do, also has a new labor reform. Germany is leaning into trying to reduce arrivals and asylum applications, but also has a fairly ambitious, not totally successful, but fairly ambitious immigration reform. So we are seeing, in Korea and Japan, which have always been, and again, have the advantage of distance and an island in one case, peninsula island, they have the advantage of being a little bit distant, but have also been cautious about arrivals. But as a result, have actually been able to lean into now thinking about legal pathways at a time when demography warrants it. So let me lay out 3 sets of principles here of what I think we need to think about for the future. And then we can, I'm timing myself here because I don't want to go over time, but 3 principles I think we need to think about. So the first is we need to be intentional about building legal channels for people to come in. If we want this to work, if we want to be able to figure out how countries that have surplus labor can contribute them to people that do not have it and make this work in ways that are regular and predictable for advantages for both sides, right? We have to actually figure out these channels. And we're going to have to be proactive about it. And the way Canadians and Australians have been, Japan is now doing, Italy is doing, and others. That means thinking about a mix of permanent pathways, because some jobs are permanent. Seasonal, some jobs are seasonal. It's okay to have seasonal work. And by the way, lots of people, lots of potential migrants would love to do seasonal work and live in their home country and come back. There's always challenges with anything that's temporary in terms of imbalance of power, but with employers, but it works very well in places where it is policed well. And then there's temporary work, because also in the mobile society, this is particularly true of knowledge workers. I mean, we've always thought that we want people co-located, right? We want everyone to be together. Increasingly in a mobile world, in fact, I'm surprised there's lots of us here in one room. This is kind of a rare experience for most of us, right? Don't we spend our days, sitting on the screens? We do lots of work across screens. You still need to bring people together periodically, however, right? And so we may want to think, particularly for some kinds of work, and this is probably more high end, that we don't actually need permanent immigration, but we do need the ability for people to come and go. Right? We do need a team, an innovation team to get together, a management team to be able to get together on a regular basis for a period of time. And then we're going to have to think agilely about this. One ways of approaching this are skills partnerships. I'll let the others focus on that because they have much more expertise. But I would say access matters. We've done some looking at skills partnerships between countries in Europe and several countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And there are lots of unseen barriers to access. And that will actually matter as these things scale up. I mean, scaling up labor partnerships really matters. And at the same time, it really matters who has access and how people get access. We can talk more about that later if people want to. And finally, actually thinking about transitions between education and work matter. There's some countries like Korea and Japan that are doing a lot of work on this. In the US, historically, we've actually done a lot of work on this, particularly for high-skilled work. But actually thinking that for many countries, people who come into the education system are often prime candidates to stay and move into the workforce. So something that we should focus on. Second principle is that we need to invest in the credibility of legal immigration systems or legal migration systems. This is not something you tend to hear from people who say the first principle, that we need legal channels. We often leave off the second part, which is we need to make sure people use those channels. I think many of us who are immigrants, children of immigrants, married to immigrants, live in immigrant communities, we're very comfortable with people, whether they come legally or not, right? It doesn't matter to us a whole lot. But I think we should assume that in most societies, publics lose confidence with immigration systems if most people don't come through legal channels, right? And we do have to be sensitive to that, and we have to be conscious of that as a real need. And so this makes it important to figure out how you reduce irregular migration. By the way, I think it's hard to, unless you're draconian, it's hard to reduce irregular migration when the economy is good. Going back to Danny's slide and his previous paper on this, unless you have legal channels, there's a reinforcing effect. But the opposite is true. Legal channels don't work unless you also enforce them, right? And make sure they work. Pacing matters, and I think we need to be sensitive to pacing, to timing, how the effects on schools, the effects on healthcare systems, the effects on housing. This is an issue that's being debated in Canada right now, right? As the number of migrants shot up, the actual pressures on housing, not all which was driven by immigration, but it's an easy target and certainly was a contributing factor. And we need to think about redesigning humanitarian protection. And I know this is controversial, probably in this group, most groups that I'm in, but the reality of sort of open-ended asylum processes will probably not survive. I mean, de facto, we do not have an asylum system on the US border right now. And I'm not sure it's coming back. And I'm afraid we may see Europe go that way. But there is a midpoint where you can make asylum of non-neighboring countries or non-nearby countries much higher standard, preserve it at a much higher standard, and invest much more in regional protection, much more in legal pathways for resettlement, and much more in making employment-based pathways accessible to refugees and displaced populations. So happy to talk more about that. But I think we do have to have that. Displacement is not going to go away. In fact, it's probably going to increase over time in a post-liberal order, global liberal order world. And so we do have to think about this as part of the equation. The final thing I would say is we need to think, the third principle be how we incorporate people who migrate into the destination societies. Integration really matters, right? And it's actually one of the toughest pieces of this. And it's not just about entry, it's about remaining. There is an increasing body of economic research, and I would recommend a paper that is Leah Bustan and others et al. It's a group of researchers that published both through the National Bureau of Economic Research and through the Institute for Labor Economics that looks at 15 countries. And one of the things they find is that countries that have a history of immigration, the UK, Australia, Canada, US, the second generation born in the country has much more upward mobility than in countries where there's less history of immigration. Now, there's a lot of things you need to dig down in this, right? Which they have not had a chance to do yet, which is how did people arrive? Were they refugees? Were they labor immigrants? I mean, yes, questions, what income level, so on and so forth. So I don't think this is definitive, but I think it tells us something we intuitively know already, which is you need to have templates for immigrants to come, those who are going to stay permanently, to become part of their country, for their kids to be part of the country, and to have mechanisms to succeed over time. And this leads us to a set of things that we're ill-prepared to deal with and frankly have to be dealt with in national contexts, right? The World Bank can be helpful on this, but ultimately these are national decisions. I mean, and some of these are about mediating institutions at a local level, schools, community organizations, migrant-led organizations that can help their own coming in. What is the institutional context? Some of this is about debates around national identity, right? I mean, and these are tough conversations, right? Some countries have very fluid national identities. Australia, right? Australia, that's not always been fluid. It's actually, and it's not that there aren't debates and that there isn't pushback and there isn't inequality in it, but there's some ability and some notion in Australia. You can come from India and you could end up, by the way, UK, you could be of Indian descent with your parents born in Uganda and end up as prime minister. Right? Now, maybe a harder road, maybe there's a lot of inequality, certainly, but not a crazy idea all of a sudden, right? That's not equally true everywhere, right? And so these are going to get into questions that are really tough that have to be answered in national contexts about who gets to belong. And I think we just need to be aware that's there. So let me just conclude by saying one way or another, we're going to see a world of increased mobility. In a pessimistic scenario, this is going to lead to enormous tensions, reassertions of narrow ideas of national identity, and lots of conflict between nations. Like, why are you letting your people come over here? That would never happen in this country, right? In an optimistic scenario, we will build the right channels for people to move. Those channels will also, as Shagler said, also involve upskilling people, for people both to move and to stay with greater skills. These channels will be enforceable. We'll actually make sure that they're respected, and we'll be sensitive to the fact that we don't want people moving outside those channels for the most part. and we will invest in integration, right? And this will be a win-win for both sending countries and for receiving countries. In reality, I suspect we're going to end up with a little bit of both in different places, and we're going to have to figure out how to navigate this going forward. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much to Ishani and Danny for inviting me to be here today. What I'm going to talk about is I'm going to think a little bit about the development impacts on migrant origin countries. I'm going to focus this particularly thinking about human capital and the way that this responds to international migration. So I don't think I have to convince you that international migration rates are high and they've been increasing globally. And this is particularly true for skilled workers. For example, 18% of workers from low-income countries with a bachelor's degree are currently living in the OECD. And so as a result of this, researchers, policymakers, government officials often argue that this sort of international migration is going to lead to a loss of human capital in countries of origin, something we colloquially refer to as brain drain. Okay, this is particularly pervasive in arguments about healthcare workers. Okay, we've seen this ramp up during the COVID-19 pandemic as it became particularly apparent, the global shortages that we had for medical workers. Okay, but I think while it may be intuitive to think about that when people leave, they take their human capital with them and this depletes the origin country, what I want to think a little bit about today is how migration opportunities may also be able to lead to increases in human capital, what we can refer to as brain gain. Okay, and so there are a number of mechanisms through which this process could happen. And I would say historically, we haven't had a lot of evidence on this. Economists have talked about this as a potential channel, but they haven't really empirically been able to estimate this. And in the past several years, there's been a lot of progress made on this as an empirical channel. Okay, so what I want to talk about first is I want to kind of put forth some of the theoretical underpinnings of what we're thinking here in terms of the way these mechanisms might work. Okay, so this is a figure from the paper that Danny mentioned that we just had come out in Science, and I think it does a nice job of hopefully helping illustrate the different channels that I'm thinking about here. Okay, so I want to start with the most obvious path. And what I want to think about is how migration opportunities can lead to impacts on human capital. So let's start on the left and go toward this brain drain channel where I talk about immigration. This is sort of the intuitive case. People leave, they take their human capital with them. Okay. Now, alternatively, if you look above this, okay, toward educational investments, there's another story, okay? So perhaps the prospect of future migration actually incentivizes people to invest in education that they wouldn't have bothered to if the only labor market opportunities available to them were those available in their origin country, okay? If not all of those individuals choose to migrate, which is typically the case given restrictions on labor mobility, this can actually lead to an increase in human capital in migrants' countries of origin. Okay, so that's sort of the other direct pathway that I'm thinking about here. Now, I want to leave that one aside for a minute. I'm going to come back to it. And I want to come back to this brain drain channel where we have people leaving and taking their human capital with them. Okay, what I want to argue is that there are still a number of other theoretical mechanisms through which international migration can actually lead to increases in human capital. Okay, so let's start with probably the most obvious. That's the one on the bottom, where we think about that people leave and they send financial remittances back home, okay? They send these financial remittances back home. This can have direct impacts on investment in human capital, okay? More people go to school. Can also have direct impacts on income, on consumption, on investment, as well as on investments in health, okay? Similarly, we can think about return migration. Okay, we have lots of circular migration, temporary migration happening around the globe right now. And so many of these workers are going to come back home again. Okay, and when they come back home, there's been some evidence that shows that this leads to more innovation at home. It leads to more entrepreneurship. It leads to better trade linkages between origin and destination countries in a way that has real development impacts and real impacts on human capital. Okay. You don't need the workers to return home, though, to necessarily reap these benefits, okay? We're living in a world where technology is expanding, people are communicating on WhatsApp and social media and Zoom, and so these knowledge transfers can happen even in the absence of this sort of return migration. Okay, and so these knowledge transfers can lead to some of these channels about innovation and business development, But they can also lead to what many in the field have started calling social remittances. Okay, so there can be these transfers of norms from the destination country back to the origin country. There's some really nice evidence that thinks about this in terms of socio-political outcomes. So thinking about particularly when migrants go to more democratic destination countries, these democratic norms often gets transmitted back to the country of origin and can have real meaningful change in terms of the political systems in the country of origin. I have some relatively new work with Susan Godlinton where we look at this in terms of fertility norms, okay? And so we look at migrants going abroad, they get exposed to, say, new reproductive health policy. Maybe the pill is legalized in their destination country. When they're exposed to this, this transmits back to their country of origin, and fertility actually reduces beyond just the migrants themselves through the mechanism of increased adoption of modern contraceptives, okay? So these sorts of channels can really matter in terms of shaping things socially beyond the story that we've kind of all been telling about financial remittances for a really long time. Still super important, but I just want to push you to think beyond that financial remittance story, okay? These things can matter in the long run. I have some other new work with a few co-authors where we're thinking about positive income shocks to migration for Filipino migrants. And we can show that 20 years after these income shocks, there are real increases, not only in global income, but in domestic income coming through entrepreneurship and increased investment in education. So thinking of these mechanisms, I think what I want to argue is, at least theoretically, and there's a lot of empirical evidence too, this human capital, there can be real human capital effects kind of diffusing through migration. Okay, so for what I want to do for the rest of my time today is focus on a case study where migration leads to increases in human capital in the origin country. Okay, and I'm going to focus specifically on this top channel about educational investments. And I'm going to think about a case in the Philippines where incentives to invest in human capital due to migration opportunities led to gains in human capital. And behind this figure, there are a lot of really great empirical work that I'm not going to have time to talk about today. So I just point you toward this review piece that we have in Science to dig into some of that. I'm happy to chat more at lunch as well. Okay, so when we think about many wealthy countries, many of them have shortages of medical workers, and they're relying on workers from developing countries to fill in as nurses, as doctors, and other medical professionals, care workers broadly. By the same token, many origin countries, many lower income countries, are actually developing migration policy to actually encourage the migration of healthcare professionals as part of their development strategy. The Philippines, I think, is the example of a country that's done this for the longest, largely because of the colonial ties between the US and the Philippines, and the US setting up nursing schools back in the 1940s. But I think thinking about this, we're kind of left in this situation where we think about, how is this working? Is this leading to brain drain? Okay, so Filipinos broadly come as nurses to the United States. About 74% of Filipino nurses who migrate come to the United States, and their opportunities to come to the United States are largely dictated by US visa policy. Okay, and so what I'm going to show you in this figure, what I've done here is I've plotted Filipino migrants to the United States and to other countries along here. And so you can see that between 1990 and 2000, this was relatively stable. Okay, that was about, say 1,500 workers coming each year on visas to the United States. In 2000, we start to see this increase. Okay, so what happened in 2000? Well, in 2000, the United States lifted the 7% cap on countries of origin in terms of diversification of where people could come from. So they lifted that. They also authorized the use of some employment-based visas, EB3 visas, that hadn't been used before. And they prioritize Schedule A occupations, which are occupations where there's a shortage, which is what nursing falls under. Okay, so what do we see here? We see a really dramatic increase in the number of Filipinos that are coming to the US as nurses between 2000 and 2006. Okay, by 2006, this is about 7,000 individuals coming on nursing visas each year. 2007, policy changes, 7% caps back in place. The EB3 visas that were unused have now been used up, and we see this dramatic drop in 2007. Okay, it increased a little bit. It didn't go quite back to the original levels, but it never increases back to these levels that we see during this kind of period where visas are relatively available. Okay, so what Paolo and I do in our paper is we use these shocks to immigration policy from US visa policy, and we combine it with geographic migrant networks in the Philippines. So like most places, migrant networks really matter in terms of where people go abroad and the occupations that they do in destination countries. And so we're able to combine these two things to have places where they have historically sent lots of nurse migrants to the US. Those are sort of our treated places. And then we have places that haven't had a lot of nurse migration to the US. And so we combine these two sources of variation to investigate this using an event study and look at the implications that this has on human capital back in the Philippines. Now, I'm actually just going to show you this in the aggregate today. I think one of the reasons I like this paper is because I can just show you a time series and it tells you the whole story. If you want to see the event studies, they're all in the paper, but I think the time series actually makes this in a really compelling way. Okay, so what I've done here is this is plotting 4-year enrollment in tertiary education in the Philippines over time. Okay, and so you can see nursing in black, and you can see that this follows that liberalization of visas, kind of the expansion of visas for Filipinos to the US, and then the subsequent contraction. Okay, so in 2000, we start to see enrollment increase pretty dramatically. We're going from around 150,000 individuals enrolling in nursing school over, so this is, in the Philippines, you have to have a 4-year degree to become a nurse. So this is all 4 years of enrollment. And so you see this go from about 150,000 in the year 2000 to about 550,000, okay, by the peak of this. Now, I just want to draw your attention back to this. We were going from 1,500 to 7,000 visas. What we see here is going to almost 550,000 people enrolled in school. And we see, if you look at graduation, you can see the same picture. It's just lagged 4 years because it takes 4 years to finish your degree. So what this resulted in is this visa expansion led to about a 247% increase in the number of nursing graduates. Now, in the Philippines, you also have to pass a nursing licensure exam. If they come to the US, they also have to pass the NCLEX. But what we find is that for each additional nurse who migrated to the US on a visa, 9 more passed the licensure exam. Okay, it's important that we think about licensure because we want to make sure that they actually meet the standards to actually practice in a Filipino hospital. And so we find these 9 more licensed nurses. Now, the enrollment effects, you can see this here, are really driven by switches from other fields. Okay, so you see these dips in business and education and STEM that are kind of trading off with the increases in nursing. However, people appeared to persist to degree at higher rates in nursing. And so we actually find an overall increase in the amount of people that have a tertiary education. So we see an overall increase in, regardless of degree type, in the number of people that got a tertiary education. Okay, so what made this possible? So I think economists for a while, that you can look at some writings, from 20 or 30 years ago that say, yeah, theoretically brain drain seems like it could be possible, but the supply is not going to respond. So it's not going to be able to happen empirically. Okay, so what we're able to do with the Philippines data, which is pretty amazing, is we can look at the supply of nursing programs. Okay, so I've just again plotted this for you, just the time series across the country as a whole. And you can see that there was a dramatic increase in nursing schools in response to demand for people to get nursing degrees. This was driven mostly by private institutions. Okay, and I want to emphasize the Philippines has a very well-developed tertiary education system. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. This increase was driven almost entirely by existing institutions adding programs rather than entirely new schools. And the enrollment effects that we find are coming from provinces that had a lot of tertiary education institutions, but didn't have nursing programs. So Amherst College adds a nursing degree, okay? Not the new nursing school of Amherst, Massachusetts opens. It's coming through the former, okay? Okay, so where does this leave us? Okay, so brain drain and brain circulation are more than just theoretical possibilities. I think what this paper shows is that you can experience these real gains in human capital as a result. But I want to emphasize a number of other things, okay? Because I think for me, this project on Filipino nurses has led to even more questions that I think we need input on. So the outcomes may differ in poorer countries, okay? They may differ in more fragile economies. They may differ in conflict-prone regions, okay? There may be fewer opportunities in those places for skill acquisition. And so that supply side response may differ. And I think what our work shows is the supply being flexible and agile, and this speaks to some of what was mentioned before, is going to be really important for for low-income countries to get the benefits of this. The other thing I want to mention is that a lot of the literature focuses on low middle income and middle income countries that are quite large. Okay, so Philippines, India, and Mexico. We need to take this literature to other places that may be vulnerable to try to push this forward. Okay. And so I think the other place that I really think we need to push on is what are effective policies for origin regions, okay? Really, we need to consider the general equilibrium effects for all of the relevant labor markets, okay? So if people are switching to nursing, does that mean they're not engineers and infrastructure is not happening at home in the ways that it would have before? Okay, what are these switches happening? I think perhaps obviously, what are the externalities in terms of health and well-being for the population in countries of origin? And then I think thinking about, are countries investing in the wrong type of skill? And you can think of this at a pretty micro level. There are a lot of anecdotes in the Philippines that nurses that want to go abroad, they're investing in geriatric skills. They want to go to Japan, they want to go to Israel and work in those places. And so as a result, that's not what the Philippines needs. The Philippines still needs pediatric care. It still needs OBGYNs, right? And so this heterogeneity may have implications at home as well. And one last point that I want to make on this before I'll conclude is like, do countries actually capitalize on this brain gain? Okay, so, I think I can show you in the time series, this is pretty compelling in terms of the number of nurses. But if I talk to, say, the Department of Labor in the Philippines or the Department of Health, they're still reporting shortages of nurses in hospitals, okay? Now, why is that? Okay, when I talk to nurses about this, they'll say, yeah, well, or people who got a nursing degree, they'll say, well, the conditions are terrible, the wages are terrible. I'd prefer to work in a call center or BPO and use my nursing skills, for an insurance company or something like that. And so thinking about how we can help the labor markets in origin countries actually make use of these gains in human capital, I think is really important. Okay, so the last things that I'll say are just that international migration shapes the labor force. It shapes the human capital that happens in the labor force. And so on the previous slide, hopefully I outlined some areas where I think we need future work. But the last point that I want to leave you with is that there's been a lot of good empirical work that has looked at origin country responses to migration shocks. Okay, and this has been really important for being able to document these human capital responses. And I hate to knock this because that's what most of my work has been, is looking at migration shocks and seeing what happens. But I think where we need to go next is not there, okay? That work is great, but what future work needs to do is really think about partnerships with policymakers to actively identify the types of policies that will enhance the benefits for origin countries, for the migrants themselves, and for the destination countries. And I think things like diaspora engagement, as well as the global skills partnerships we've talked about, are things that have a lot of potential, and these partnerships are going to be really important. So thank you so much.
All right. Well, this was fantastic, and I don't know if I'm gonna disappoint you going back to the microphone myself, but we have a bit of about 20 minutes, 15. So I'm gonna do. I just have to do a round of questions myself, and then we're gonna open it. Can you tell me when you have like 7 minutes, like 8 minutes ish or something? Help me. This is going to be very hard because I'm throwing you questions that are hard to answer, but just let's try to be concise. I loved your football example, and I appreciate you calling it football very much. Because a big part of this, which we probably won't be able to go too much in detail, is about the financing of these models. And it's a completely private sector endeavor. And I wonder if you have thought, and you probably had, like how much of this is actually replicable to other industries? Because I guess in the football example, there's a bit of a portfolio approach. Like one of these people is going to be the next Messi, and that's going to bring millions and millions of dollars. It's not the same. You cannot say that about manufacturing or nurses, I guess. So tell us, what are the lessons, or one lesson, or how would you think this about for other industries, perhaps? Is this actually doable, or you foresee that this will always need some sort of public sector involvement?
I can speak hours about football, but the short answer, I don't think I agree with you, Danny, because I don't think when Barcelona or Ajax sets up a football academy, they think they're going to find the next Messi. Because if they find the next Messi, which happened with Messi, they bring him to Spain at age 10, right? The whole thing there is actually partially, I honestly believe, some sort of social service and provide education. And most of these players go to second or third tier countries. They go play in Poland and they play in Latvia and stuff. The really talented ones, they identify at a young age and they bring them to the Netherlands and Spain right away. But now football is a very small market, but it works really well as an example because there's minimal government intervention and it is so close to the hearts of the consumer. If the government said in Italy or Spain or England, we're not going to allow any more foreign players, you would have riots. I mean, there are British English teams which don't have a single English player. And I think 49 of the top 50 players in the world are playing in a country in which they're not citizens of. So it's an anomaly in a way. But the unique thing about football, what I'm going to tell you, compared to the doctors from Africa, if you look at the data, the growth of the doctors' migration and the football players is almost identical. So I had those slides in other presentations. You cannot tell them apart. The difference is what Carolyn said, is the supply response. The training, the medical school facilities in Africa did not expand with increased demand from high income, but the football markets did, right? I think that's where the private sector plays a key role. If it can be addressed through private sector, it's nursing, or actually shipping crews in the Philippines, it's the same thing. Private training facilities address that, or football players, and we kind of keep the governments and even sometimes the World Bank out of it. The markets actually do pretty well, right? I think that's what we should be focusing on, how to set up the legal framework as we talked about, that the legal pathways are there where the rights are protected and the locals, the natives in the migrant destination country are also protected, but also the full rights of the migrants and their credentials are recognized. Finding those systems, and I think the market kind of takes care of it. I mean, I come from a left-wing family. My father would be devastated me saying, but the private markets, I think, take care of it. I think that's what the football markets are teaching us.
Let me take that and go to Caroline, because I was very struck by what you said at the end on how to capitalize the brain gain, and there was shortages of nurses in the Philippines, but the wages weren't maybe adjusting as fast, or that the market maybe wasn't getting that cue. So bigger question for you, but also maybe if you can be brief about, because you thought about this, what would you say are like important policies or key ideas to keep in place to actually capitalize on that brain game? Because I think that's kind of the core, one of the cores of the issue on how to really make this a win-win.
Yeah. Is this okay? It's on. Yeah, I think that's a great question, Danny. And I think frustratingly, I think that question gets more or less attention as political administrations change in the origin country. So there was a lot of interest in the Philippines in thinking about this maybe 5 years ago, and then priorities changed and there's sort of been less interest in thinking about it. But some of the ideas that we were talking about were twofold. So first, I told you that for each licensed nurse that goes abroad, or each nurse that goes abroad, there are 9 newly licensed nurses. Well, there are also a bunch of people who never passed the licensure exam. Okay, these schools that increased weren't all great schools. And so there's a lot of concern about people that invested in a costly degree and couldn't actually work in the profession that they were trained to do. And so one of the things that we were talking about was trying to develop some retraining programs, because they actually have a lot of skill now. Maybe they could migrate as caregivers, not as a nurse, but as a caregiver. Maybe they could work as, the Philippines has a lot of these like rural healthcare workers. They don't need to be a nurse, but they could do some sort of training along those lines. So thinking about ways that we can capitalize on that. And then I think that there's been some discussion about like, how can we improve the conditions in the local hospitals in such a way that it's a more appealing place to work. And I think the Department of Labor was really keen to kind of push some ideas forward on that front. So maybe a little bit stalled now in terms of thinking about it. So yeah, I don't know if I have more to say than that.
No, that's a great insight. Andrew, going back to the difficult part of the policy making, which Jalar kind of also explained about all the different departments and ministries that need to be involved. You've spent a lot of time with decision makers talking about this. So what are another very easy question? What are the low-hanging fruits in terms of I don't know if you want to go through the narrative or the actual policy making to actually make this again a win-win with the decision makers that are maybe worried about all the things you said, the social narrative or the social cohesion, all these aspects. So what would be kind of at this stage in where the world is, kind of a good way to get this past the political process in a way that it's being appreciated as a win-win-win?
Let me start by saying something that is not in my self-interest, since I work at a place called the Migration Policy Institute, but it is better not to talk about it as migration. And I'm actually serious about that. I mean, I think the conversation about labor markets, about skills, about, I think gets you broader buy-in. You can find very few countries. I mean, again, you go back to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where immigration has always been part of economic policy. And you say immigration, and most people go, yeah, that's about skills, it's about population growth. We got that, But most other countries, immigration is still a controversial word, and it's slightly isolated. And people who run the immigration policy tend not to be strong actors within the interagency system. Right. So vis-a-vis labor ministries, vis-a-vis treasury, vis-a-vis, or finance ministries, vis-a-vis commerce, vis-a-vis other ministry, education, that you need to get engaged. That's, I think, Tyler's point, what I think was really important actually in Germany, where, I mean, the fact that the World Bank comes in is really useful. Outside actors matter a lot. The fact that actually your counterparts are often finance ministries is really helpful. Actually, something we found, we keep bemoaning the fact that we don't spend enough time with finance ministries, and then we still don't spend enough time with finance ministries. But in fact, a lot of things we keep recurrently discovering, a lot of immigration policy, and this is particularly true in developing countries more perhaps than say in highly industrialized countries, but finance ministries drive a lot of policy decisions because they actually get the labor market questions and the innovation question. I mean, there's a whole question around innovation, which we haven't talked about in high-skilled immigration as well, but they're actually really looking at this as an economic issue, and finance ministries are really important, right? They do tend to have a lot, because they do budgets, right? They tend to have a lot of weight with other ministries. And so I think figuring out who the actors are, it's very easy to get the immigration people excited about things, but they may not always be. And look, those are often our counterparts, right, who we're talking to. But I do think it is important thinking about who the other stakeholders are that may actually be able to weigh in. And then the other thing we found, we did some work with Colombia, for example, the Colombian government, on putting together an interagency process. And the other thing is, on immigration, you tend not to have interagency processes, even in the US, by the way. I mean, they're sort of a vague, there was eventually sort of a senior advisor on immigration at the White House, but it was actually a fragmented way of, we have a fairly fragmented way of dealing with immigration policy in this country. But it's true most places, right? And so when you get into things, in the case in Colombia, where there were 2.8 million Venezuelans who have come over the past few years, the next generation of issues are not the province of the immigration agency or the foreign ministry, right? Who are interested in the question of who could come and whether people got legal status and all that. But the next set of questions really are about, what are the barriers to access to education for a kid to sign in who doesn't have, the birth certificate, family left the other country without the birth certificate, they don't have any history of their studies. We're discovering a lot of people actually leave school for reasons we don't know in Latin America, among particularly Venezuelans. And so figuring that out, you need the education ministry of that. And so figuring out who the stakeholders, so creating the interagency, and it's something the Colombian government did, but we were fortunate to be able to accompany them in this. Figuring out how you create an interagency that's got everyone at the table is really helpful, because most of the time they're not thinking about immigrants as a separate group, even though they may actually have some specific needs that they need to address.
Okay, thank you. We are going to take a couple, and this is my fault that I took much time, but a couple of questions from the public and then wrap up. And I'm not going to be able to take all those, but we are going to stick around here for more questions kind of in the coffee break. So the lady here and the gentleman over there, I don't know.
I'm Fiona Stewart. I'm the global lead here at the Bank on Aging and Pensions. Just wanted to ask about the totally agree, underappreciated megatrend, but the speed of the aging, I think, is also really underappreciated. How do we make sure in these programs that we're not targeting countries where the window of this demographic change is happening so fast that by the time the programs, et cetera, are in place, the window is actually shut? So do we need to think about the speed of the demographic window as well when we're building these sort of programs?
Mm-hmm. All right, let's take that one and then we'll answer. Yes.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alejandro Lara, and the line of my research is about lifelong learning, aging, and productive aging. And I encounter a gap in the migration system doing my research. And my question is threefold, all related. I would like to know if there is any database that assess people, migrants, at a point of entry, because in that way, the country will reduce the burden on in those individuals, right? That there will be better place if they assess that, for example, Andrew has 20 years of experience as a plumber in your own country. So, therefore, X country will be able to place you at a specific organization or company.
All right.
I say threefold.
Okay, quickly, very quickly, please.
And I understand there is a handful of countries doing that, but very few. So, in that way, if we know that, then one will reduce again the burden, and two will be better allocate those training resources. If we know what are the skill, the knowledge, the skills of abilities of those migrants. So that's the threefold question. So please provide a few samples. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. We're gonna take who you guys volunteered there. There's the one on the speed of the aging. I think you might want to say something about that.
So the second question, I think we're going to have a whole new ABCDE next year for that. So I don't know. So it's exactly about the speed of aging. I think nobody anticipated it. I think a lot of demographers, some are not, but some are still not fully coming to grasp. And it is true, but the alternative is we do nothing, which is even worse. Whatever we do, I think we need to do it quickly, but it is absolutely about the speed of aging, and especially, the speed of the fertility decline, and it is almost irreversible in many countries. China is implementing all these policies, but you look at the trends, I don't know if we can come out of it. So, but it goes back to why labor market policies, education policies, and migration policies, those are the figures I showed, they need to be complementary. And fortunately, the labor market, I'm not a labor economist per se, but people work longer, people work part-time. So that's got to be part of the solution. But the speed of aging, by speed of aging, I don't mean we physically aging, but basically the share of the elderly people in the population is increasing. There is nothing we can do about it, right? I mean, it's a natural phenomena. It has to be a direct part of the decision-making process, which we have ignored for a long time.
I'm gonna a little bit answer your question, even though I'm the moderator, and kind of also maybe reframing, which is like, do you guys know of any examples in terms of databases or information where this could actually leverage the situation? I do know of an NGO called Talent Beyond Boundaries, who do a little bit of this, maybe not at the port of entry, but they actually do collect data on people who are willing to, maybe I'm not explaining it well, so I'm not going to put my words in their mouth, but collecting data on people who are willing to move in terms of labor data and CVs and experience, and sharing this with employers in other places. So that's one, but I don't know if you have other examples or you want to add anything in general about that.
I think I would just add that I think this sometimes happens on the private sector side in a place like the Philippines, where active recruiters are working quite aggressively in cities like Manila. Some of those jobs are going government to government through bilateral agreements. And so the Department of Migrant Workers in the Philippines gets these jobs, and they sort of have a bunch of people that have applied for them that they can put into these jobs. Now, it's not quite the database you're thinking about, but I think it's helping facilitate those flows and the match between destination countries and origin countries.
There's different experiments on this. I mean, there's experience with like the Philippines doing that on people, their own nationals who might want to work elsewhere. The Canadian government does it for people who apply, right? They have ranking people according to human capital. I'll come back to that in 1 second. The U.S. government tried to do this with the mobility offices, safe mobility offices, though it was fairly crude. I mean, they knew that they were trying to refine it, but actually figure out they were much better at figuring out who had protection needs than they were in figuring out people's skills, and they started to rebalance it, and they are no more. So that kind of ended. The European Union has been trying to do a talent database, and I've lost track whether they've launched it or not, but they were trying to do a talent database for people who might want to come to Europe, to different countries, be available to different national governments. So there's a lot of thinking about this. The challenge in the end, I mean, there's some skills that are really easy to measure, like the plumbers, right? That you really want someone who knows. You don't want me doing your plumbing, right? I mean, that would be bad. You don't know me, but you don't want me doing your plumbing. So there are certain skills you want to know if someone's an actual accountant, a certified accountant, if they're a certified nurse. But the labor market of the future is going to be much more flexible and fluid than the labor market of the past, right? I mean, I think we should assume that things will shift over time. And so the larger question is also broader human capital. Also, who is able, who just has skills, but who is able to adapt, right, as things change. I mean, a certain programming language, great, but that programming language may be irrelevant in 5 years, right? And so who has the ability to adapt and I think that's a larger challenge. And by the way, that's a huge, if you talk to HR people at large companies, I mean, they'll tell you the same thing. It's hard to measure, right? I mean, this is the kind of, and I'm not, there's an answer to that even on how you do it. I mean, and for companies that recruit abroad, by the way, they do actually, where this is really happening is in employment-based migration. Companies, either through intermediaries, recruitment agencies, or themselves, are looking at skill sets. But it has the same limitations it does for domestic workers, right? Which is the kind of things we really value for all of us that have hired people, right? The kind of stuff we really, really value in hiring someone that sets someone apart is actually really hard to measure, and much harder to measure across a cultural divide.
We need to migrate to the coffee break, I think.
So go to the WDR.
Sorry,
website,
no, don't.
WDR 2023. We have all the migration data there. You'll see it for the whole world, bilateral by education. Yeah.
Thank you. Wrap up your panel.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. We're going to stick around, and there's, of course, this is a very important ongoing discussion, and hopefully we have more forums here and elsewhere to continue talking about it. Thank you.
And you continue these. You can continue these conversations at lunch after the next event, but not right now, but yes. Please leave the stage. Okay, so while we work in that transition, we are at the last event of this fantastic conference, and that is going to be a fireside chat between Mamta Murthy, who is the vice president for the People Vice Presidency of the World Bank, and David Evans, who is a senior fellow and newly minted program director of the education program at the Center for Global Development. They will speak until about 1, and we'll go directly to lunch after that, and you'll have a chance to continue these conversations. Thank you.
All right, it's always exciting to be the final session between people and their lunches. But this has been an amazing week. I'm particularly excited to be chatting with Mamta, who is the Vice President of people now, which sounds very grand, and it is. And I'll just share, I've had the opportunity to work for Mamta for many years, from when she was the director of operations in the Africa region, and I was working in the Africa Chief Economist's office. So we've heard a lot about human capital and human development this week, especially in the last couple of days. We've heard about education and people movement with migration and health. What I would argue are many of the most visceral, fundamental issues in development, right? Whether people have the skills to enjoy a long and lustrous life, whether there are markets for that, whether they have the food to grow up unstunted and have the full cognitive and development that comes with that. So I remember a few years ago, we were all looking at, huge drops in human capital in the context of the COVID crisis. A lot of those have bounced back in a lot of places, but Mom, to kick us off, like, how do we think about human capital now, 5 years on from COVID?
Thank you, Dave, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really, I'm really happy to have been invited, and I'm delighted that this ABCDE focused so much on human development, even though it wasn't a part of the title. I should clarify that I don't work on human resources at the World Bank. A lot of people think I do. I get email every day from people who want to be recruited by the World Bank, and they think I'm the VP for HR, but I'm not. I cover health, education, social protection, labor markets, the human capital project, gender. Okay, so great question. I would not say that human capital has bounced back from COVID, from the destruction that COVID wrought. But I would say that things like primary enrollment are probably back, vaccination rates are back up, but it remains the case that many kids were out of school during COVID, and the learning assessments that have been done since COVID show that in at least 2/3 of the countries where learning assessments have been done, learning levels are not back up to where they were pre-COVID. So there is a long-term effect on learning. And we know, because learning is cumulative, it's going to take a while unless remedial measures are put in place. The second thing I would say is that COVID had a huge impact on premature adult mortality. So adults dying before they should. And those levels are still elevated. In fact, we are producing a new human capital index, which for the first time is actually going to also take into account it's going to take into account human capital built post 18 years of age. And one of the shocking things that it's going to show is that in many countries, there's a destruction of human capital post age 18 because of adult mortality. You know, we think of, we were talking about aging, right, which is related to growing longevity, but it remains the case that many developing countries face elevated death rates between the ages of 25 and 55, which is how we are looking at it. So I would say that some things have improved, but there are lingering long-term effects. To which I want to add that we've just come out with a new edition of Global Economic Prospects. INDERMIT leads that, and growth rates are not looking that rosy for developing countries, and that means that we're going to continue to have problems in the labor market. There are going to be many people who are not going to find jobs. Even in India, which is the bright spark in terms of growth rates, it is the case that many young people are not able to find jobs that can give them a decent quality of life. So bottom line, things are looking up, but there are still long-term issues that persist.
So as a follow-up to that, there's one of the things you mentioned was that we have this big destruction of human capital with learning loss. And if we don't take action towards remedial, measures, that those kids will never recover. They may not recover entirely regardless. And I think there are parallels to the other sectors we've heard about in this conference. But one of the things we've heard a lot about, for example, in the education session yesterday, is how there are kind of fundamental issues, right? Violence in schools, environmental contaminants like lead exposures, right? How do we think about investments in remediation, right, which is very important right now, versus investments in obviously just making sure that the next generation of kids are, in, violence-free schools with high quality human capital transmission, like, good foundational literacy and numeracy systems. Like, there's a competition for resources there. How do we think about that trade-off?
So that's a tough question. But let me say this, the countries that have managed to do remediation have managed to do it at relatively low cost. Let me give you the example of Tamil Nadu, a province in India, the country that I come from. Even as COVID was receding, they were able to, at scale, use high school graduates. So these are not college educated young people. Use high school graduates to do learning, to read to young people after the school day is over, regularly, 5 days a week. They were given a little bit of training, but they read to young people in the evening in community centers and other such locations that young people could reach. The government of Tamil Nadu decided to do a baseline and measure how much the kids knew. And then they did a follow-up. I won't go into the methodology, but it looks like using these high school graduates to whom you're paying a relatively small sum of money and getting them to do extra instruction post school hours. So you're not relying on the teachers in school. Did allow the kids to recover in over a 6-month period, about 2/3 of what they had lost in terms of reading proficiency during COVID. Now, this is something you can do if you are a relatively well-organized provincial government. You have, some amount of civic awareness. You have a large number of high school graduates without a job and who wouldn't mind receiving a stipend and can, have the enthusiasm to read to young kids. So I think there are things that can be done that would remediate losses, which are not terribly costly in terms of financial resources. I think they do require political will and organizational ability, and I'm not putting a price on that. Now, you asked this other question about the other factors that impact learning, right? Things like air pollution, the quality of water and soil, and how do you invest in that, or do you invest in what's going on in school? That's how I'm interpreting your question. And one of the things we're doing is we are writing a new report where we are trying to look at this broader set of issues that impact human capital outcomes. And there's a explosion in literature in the past 20 years on this broader set of issues. And there are things that happen in the home, there are things that happen in the neighborhood, and there are things that happen in the workplace, all of which are important for human capital outcomes. And what this literature shows is that the effects are causal and they can be large, depending on the context, right? It's lead contamination is not an issue everywhere. Michael Kremer did his work on deworming and it showed there was a huge impact because worms are a big issue in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So what we've done in this report is we've tried to present these other factors, these settings that are important for human capital outcomes. And unlike many World Bank reports, we don't have the answer, but what we say is, hey, shouldn't policymakers be thinking about these other factors that have large causal impacts on human capital outcomes? And we ask a lot of questions in this report. We don't necessarily provide answers, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to rank using a traffic light system, depending on your context, if you find some of these other factors as being very important, here's what it is. Is it very costly? Does it require a lot of political will? Does it require a lot of organizational capacity? So it then allows policymakers to make their own decisions about what they would emphasize, depending on their context and depending on what they find and whether they have the organizational ability and so on. Let me just give you one example, which is really causing us to do a lot of rethinking of the work we do at the World Bank. Let me take you to the situation of the home and cognitive development of children. Now, you might say, oh, Mamta, this is old hat. We've known for the longest time the first 1,000 days is really important. This is why we have maternal and child health programs, and this is why we've emphasized ECD. All true. But what a lot of the literature shows is that in addition to whether your kid is born healthy and has good nutrition, cognitive stimulation really matters. It really matters how you talk to your kid. It really matters whether you read to your kid, because it's surprising, but literacy is built really early. It's built even as you're sort of babbling as a child, even as you're beginning to just sort of recognize things around you. So if that's the case, why is it that I'm not saying we shouldn't pay attention to preschool. I'm not saying we shouldn't pay attention to foundational learning. Why is it that we've given so little thought to how parents are interacting with children? Why is this not part of the public policy lexicon in a way that it should be? So that's the question, the kind of question that this report will ask. Similarly, it will ask questions about quality of air and soil. And by the way, I was shocked when I looked at these studies that show the huge impact of air pollution on learning outcomes. And this is not just because schools are closed in many countries when air pollution is high, but because air pollution actually affects your ability to learn. It actually affects whether your teacher shows up in the classroom and is able to give you instruction. So we conclude that there needs to be much more granular understanding about what is determining human capital outcomes in your neighborhood or your locality or your ward. And this needs to be the subject of public policy. I can see I've gone on too long, but let me quote Bob Zellick, who yesterday said something, or was it day before yesterday, said something very interesting. He said, we need to get out of our silos and have this horizontal awareness. And I think for human capital, we need to get out of the silo of education or health and have this awareness of settings. How is the setting, the home, the neighborhood, the workplace, determining how much human capital is built?
I think that's very true. In just a moment, I'm going to open this up for questions. So get your questions ready. And if you're online, feel free to put those in and I'll have access to those. I think one of the interesting things, you highlighted this role of, what parents do with kids in the early years. There's this wonderful book chapter by Human Development Chief Economist here at the World Bank, Norbert Shaddy, and Caridad Araujo at the IDB and others, showing how a fabulous program in Jamaica that dramatically improved how parents interact with their children, when there were efforts to scale that up in Colombia, in Peru, had dramatically lower impacts, not zero, but much, much lower impacts. And I think one of the big challenges is with programs where we don't have systems like schools or health centers, where we have kind of existing systems to deliver. Sometimes those systems work, sometimes they don't, but how we do that at scale.
I think that's a great point. We have to think about scalability and not about very small interventions. But let me expand a little bit about why this is giving us thought, giving us pause. We do a lot of work on social protection. Reem yesterday spoke a great deal about that. When we do work on social protection, we have social workers who visit households regularly. In our health work, we have community healthcare workers who visit households regularly. Is there a case for thinking about how an existing program could be done slightly differently? when you have the infrastructure in place. And by the way, these are people who are from the community. So it's not like you're bringing in somebody from the outside and asking them to support an intervention. It still means it may not work, right? And the solution to every problem is not a government program. I'm looking here straight at Indermith. He's very fond of saying this to those of us who work on these issues. But given the size of the effect and how important it seems to be, and that governments have these programs in place, isn't there a case for seeing whether this can scale? And by the way, maybe it's going to be most effective in the weakest contexts, right? Where there's really no stimulation happening at home. Poor Jamaican households might be in that context, but I've seen even poorer contexts where it could make a difference. So what the report is doing is it's not saying do this, it's saying have you thought of this? And also raising questions about a whole bunch of other things.
No, I think that's really exciting. I think especially the idea of thinking, how can we link these to systems? There was a Mexico parenting program that was rolled out in kind of a standard, just, hey, invite parents to these classes. Basically, nobody showed up. And then when it was linked to the now defunct Prospera program, and we saw from Tom Vogel's presentation some of the impacts of that. But when it was linked to that program, everybody showed up because it was linked to an existing structure that involved resources. And so people had a real incentive, and you saw the child development impacts follow along. I want to open it up. Does anybody have questions for Mamta? I see one. Great. We'll take these three, 1, 2, 3, and then come back.
Hi, good afternoon. My question is, what creates and sustains political will for human capital investment in politically unstable or short-term focused context?
My question is for Dr. Ms. Mamta. I haven't prepped my question properly, so I'm just going to say it the way it's coming to my head. So I know you said the way parents interact with their children is very important, and I agree. But I also agree that it's only to a certain amount parents can interact with their children or do or teach them certain things, because kids are always going to be faced with the outside world. So is it fair to say that social media, AI is also affecting the parents and also affecting the way the parents are communicating with their children? Because even if the kids are not on social media, the parents are on social media. And what I'm seeing, well, from what we see as the youth, like older generation is picking up on certain languages where you meet a 4 or 6-year-old who's saying something that's very trendy on TikTok, but they don't have TikTok. So it's either coming from the parents or it's coming from the kids at school. That's my question. Thank you.
Mamta knows I'm a broken record on aging, as Mamta knows. Just in terms of the human capital, thinking of a different slice of the population, the 50s and 60s, this is the first time we're just talking about population, that we've had relatively healthy people in their 50s and 60s, 1.5 billion people now in their 50s and 60s. The IMF World Economic Outlook was that 70 is the new 50 in terms of cognitive ability. How do we make sure we make that group of people, how do we use that human capital that we've never had before? How do we make sure we use that as productively as possible?
All right, let's go ahead and take those three, Mamta, 3 easy questions. How do we get the will for human capital investment? How do we think about social media and how kids are interacting with that, what the impacts of that are for human capital? And then how do we use this new resource, if you will?
So on this question about political will for human capital, I think all the evidence I know suggests that it's such an important part of economic growth that I actually don't find it hard to make the case to ministers of finance, right? And I think it was the gentleman from the Migration Policy Institute who said it's so important to be talking about to the ministries of finance because they are the ones who are tasked with thinking ahead while balancing the budget today, right? And 2/3, I'm very happy. I often use this figure, so I'm going to use it again. Anything between 1/3 to 2/3 of the difference in per capita income across countries can be attributed to human capital. So if you're not investing in it, I just don't see how you're going to grow. And ultimately, every country that I've worked on wants to become a rich country. So that's the case that I think that can be made, but that's just base one, right? The big problem is, well, where do we spend? Assuming that you have the money to spend, right? And the where do we spend is a really important question, because actually the outcomes that many, if not most countries get for the money that they spend is appallingly poor. So I think one has to, even as you make the case, you really have to be making the case for how the money can be spent well. And there are lots of things that there are lots of ways in which countries spend money very poorly. We had the discussion yesterday, right, where Shanta talked about all the teachers who are not present or in the classroom and so on, right? Or the population of the country is not even checking how the money is spent, and a lot of it might just be lost in the form of leakage. So I think we have to make the case for human capital, but also demonstrate ways in which the money can be well spent. I have a pet peeve, and I'm going to repeat it here. I'm very struck by the fact that many developing countries spend a lot on education. It can be anything between 3 to 5% of GDP. They actually spend very little on health. It's typically between 1 and 3% of GDP. And so out-of-pocket spending on health is typically very high. And, to me, it just seems these things need to go together. It just seems wrong that there's this imbalance. It's almost as if there's this belief that education will solve it all. Or it could be that teachers are very useful at the local level to win elections and community health workers are not, right? But so there may be various reasons, but it's very striking that there is a bit of an imbalance there. On this question about parents doing it all, no, parents can't do it all. But if you believe the studies, there's a huge impact in terms of cognitive development of the kid, which persists over time, depending on what happens in the very early days, right? I'm talking within the first year or two. Now, kids may go on and be saying things and doing things which are influenced by social media and AI, and there's no denying that. But you're building something, you're wiring something in the brain in those early days. And of course, it's about the income of the household, and of course, it's about nourishment, but it's also about cognitive stimulation. And it doesn't require, you don't have to be a PhD to do the things that really stimulate the child and help brain growth and development. And that has to come from a parent or a caregiver. And that's what the studies show. Now, I want to say a word about AI because one of the things that we have been excited about at the World Bank is that in addition to causing we can discuss what the impact of AI is going to be on the labor market, but it is beginning to be used to improve learning in schools. It's helping coach teachers, and it's helping kids with more personalized instruction. And this is not in high income settings alone. This is happening in Nigeria. This is happening in Peru. Of course, a school needs electricity, it needs the internet, people need devices, the teacher needs to be in the classroom. But when you have those, and you have those in many parts of the world, not all parts of the world, it can actually be a tool for improving learning outcomes. So there's that very exciting part of AI that I don't want to forget mentioning. Actually, it's just Microsoft Copilot. It's not even some customized thing. Microsoft Copilot can coach a teacher on the mistakes that she is making or he is making, because many teachers in developing countries are men and not women. It can also help a kid in terms of helping them, meeting them where they are, giving them a little bit of that personalized instruction that allows them to improve, because learning is cumulative, right? the aging question, and how do we use this cohort of I don't know, 45 to 60-year-olds who are very good and are in the labor force? Well, I would just say two things. One is that in our report, one of the things that we point to is that a lot of human capital is built in the workplace. And by having so many people who are working in the informal sector, working in small firms who are not using technology, you're actually hampering the ability of people to learn on the job and to contribute more. So we are often used to thinking about firm growth and growth of small firms to medium and large size firms as a way of employing people. But in this report, we think of firm growth as a way of educating people, of making them more skilled and more able to contribute to their economy. So that's one thing I would say, that we really need to think about the private sector and firm growth dimension of things, which we don't tend to do. We tend to think of labor supply as something that's there and might grow a little bit over time and then declines. We never think of the role of firms in actually incentivizing the improvements in human capital. The second thing I would talk about is lifelong learning. Lifelong learning systems are really weak or non-existent in developing countries. This is very striking to me. If you think of AI and how it's going to transform the way jobs are done, people do need to have the means of learning how to do new things. Obviously, there's a flow aspect. You're better at learning how to do new things if that's something that you have the ability to do. So it's your foundational learning. But you also need to have the means to learn about new technologies, to be able to move from one sort of, or to move up the ladder, right? Even in your same occupation, or move to a new occupation. And that's the thing that worries me. It was very good to hear the example of the Philippines with this private sector, which seems to be able to expand to give people the opportunity to learn things. But I don't think that's common everywhere. And that's something we need to think about.
So before we wrap up, I wouldn't mind just pushing back a little bit on the point about, for example, thinking about differentials between health spending and education spending. So I would think that we wouldn't necessarily think, if we spend more on education, it doesn't mean we value education more, or necessarily that there's a political means to it, which there, I think, often is. But I would think about, well, what's the cost of service delivery and where are we getting the highest value return? So conceivably, one could imagine that you could value both equally, but still it would make sense to spend twice as much on health or half as much on health. That it wouldn't necessarily, it just depends on how much value you're getting from the marginal sort of dollar in services. And you're welcome to respond to that, but just, I want to give you, this conference is, development in the age of populism. A lot of countries seem to be turning inward. And so just a final word from you about how do we make the case? You said it's relatively easy to make the case. I'd agree. 15 years ago, the Economic Growth Commission here, chaired here at the World Bank, said there is no example of a sustained period of economic growth without broad-based investments in human capital. It just doesn't exist. You can find little bursts, mostly driven by resource, people finding oil, but it doesn't endure. But clearly there are some governments that aren't listening to that case these days, especially international donors. And so is there something we need to change about how we talk about human capital to make that case more strongly? Last word.
So I think there's always been an element of appealing to the self-interest of the donor in making the case for aid. It may not be overt, but it's always been there. And we're good at doing this. This is how the case has been made for aid for the longest time. So I think one has to, and this might be a different moment, although I think questions about aid have been there for the longest time, right? So I think one has to appeal to the interest of the donor, the self-interest of the donor. I think there's a very strong case, very strong economic case that can be made. It's helpful to the donor if there is economic growth in other parts of the country, other parts of the world. It helps with markets. And we just talked about migration, right? There's concern about the illegal flows. There's concern about asylum seeking. Well, if there were opportunities, I think you could make the case that if there are opportunities in other parts of the world, you would see less of this. Now, some people shy away with making the self-interest case, but I think it's possible to strike that balance between making the case based on the donor's self-interest and yet having a conversation that is broader. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Again, I want to go back to what Bob Zoellick said, which struck me. And he said that, well, look, multilateral institutions such as the World Bank are a place where you can have the interests of many different shareholders discussed, right? So I feel we could have a conversation about aid, which speaks to the self-interest of donors and at the same time speaks to the needs of developing countries. So I don't think this is an either or. It can be done. At the same time, I think it's the performance of the development agency really matters. One of the reasons why people don't like development assistance is because they say, well, these development agencies don't do anything. They're bureaucratic. They are over-dimensioned. They're not transparent. So we could do a lot on that front too. That's another way of making the case for development assistance. We could be more transparent about what we do. We could talk much more about results and impact. I know that it's very hard to measure productivity in the public sector, so it's hard to talk about performance. But surely, with all these minds in the room, we can get better at doing that. And actually, we have to get better at doing that. We should also talk about results and what we achieve, and that again requires some careful thinking, right? It's not a straightforward exercise, and we could do much better at doing that. Finally, I think the data that Chalar put up was so compelling. I think we have to talk about the fact that we are living in a world where we can talk about many crises, right? Conflicts, climate, and so on. But we're talking about a world where most of the growth in population is going to happen in sub-Saharan Africa and a little bit in South Asia. And these are the parts where 7 out of 10 kids cannot read with comprehension at age 10 a paragraph in their mother tongue. That's a big issue. It's a big global issue. Right. And if we're thinking long term, like many ministries of finance are doing in developed countries, this is something that they should be thinking about. Right. So I think by appealing to self-interest, talking about some of the big challenges that everybody has to be concerned about. You'll notice that I didn't talk about pandemic preparedness, which is something we could talk at great length about, having just come out of COVID. How are we going to respond to something like that if we're not thinking about it collectively? And finally, by improving our own performance and being transparent about what we do and what results we have, I think we can make a good case.
Thank you so much, Mamta. I'd like to invite everybody to give a hand to Mamta Murthy, Vice President of People. If you need a job at the World Bank, you know who to reach out to. No, thank you so much. And we'll invite Ijani to come back and tell us what's next.
Thank you. We are done with scheduled programming. Indermeet, I think you'd like to close us out. Thank you so much, David and Mamta.
So I have this short, pleasant, but a very important task to actually thank all the people who have made this happen. Before that, the thought that struck me as Mamta was speaking, I was looking at a topic which was development in the age of populism. And I was thinking, Mamta, that maybe we need to think about this balance between global public goods and national public goods, you know? And when I think about national public goods, I can't think of a more important one than human capital, because it has these massive externalities on the health side, as well as on the skills and education side and so on. And I think that at the time when we're talking about a shift also in the way that the development agencies work, the shift from essentially aid to essentially development finance and trade and investment and migration flows and so on. I think that one has to sort of think whether or not we've got this balance right. And I think over the last few years, maybe we didn't, you know? And so we need to correct all of that. But we need to think about all of that stuff. I really enjoyed this conference. And normally when you host something, you don't enjoy it because you are quite tense about it and so on. But the team that has put this together just took away all of the worry from me and from the others. So I want to thank them. So the first group of people I want to thank are the people from the LKY School of Public Policy, especially Danny Kuan. The second group I want to thank are the people from the Center for Global Development. And I'd like to thank Mark Plant, Marcus Goldstein, Janet Hodder, Shannon Hutchins, Tara Brigham, Valencia Meredith, Stephanie Donahue, Eva Bianco, and especially Ishani Kanpal. And then from the World Bank Group, I'd like to thank Joe Rebello, Indu Kilaru, Lizette Romo, Jero Carleto, Carolina Ordon, Kristen Milholland, Maria Losi, Puntip Jindalat, Gaurav Nair, Carolyn Fisher, Asem Kalinova, and especially Kenan Karakula. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you, because you could have all of these things, you could have this great party, and if nobody came, it would be a terrible party. So thank you very much. With your eyes and your expressions and your questions, you really made this conference a big success. Thank you so much.